My mustache came in.
I didn't join a band. So if you don't tell someone what's going on.
Great, thanks. How are you?
I'm great.
Come on. I don't get you.
I always wanted to be in a band. In this line of work, you before Miles. They're Venice,
Oh, no. She seems like a good guy.
but they didn't.
Touch him again, Ned.
Another friend. After that, no way to get there.
I'm the owner's best friend.
Yeah, great. I quit, so.
We caught a break and Spider-Woman killed. I'm telling you, I can feel it.
Don't be so sure.
She killed from the
She
scene.
didn't have a choice. Yeah, I can tell.
Say, I'll
49 plane on scene. We're gonna need all the
waltz into the Guggenheim, but hey, you know what he wants?
Do you speak Italian?
I'm an sign to Spider-Woman.
Man, I'm going. Vulture!
The pinnacle of Matt's genius. It's over.
Oh, great.
Renaissance.
In some old-timey Leonardo da Vinci dimension. Am I warned?
Yes, that's pretty much.
Did I use him for no reason?
You got it.
Oh, that's cool.
Also, art. I went to the fire.
Ciao, ragazzi.
It's classified.
You're the
To another dimension.
Or?
I lead an elite strike force dedicated to this. Much cooler than a watch.
Okay, so don't mind.
It's all right, you know.
You're not funny!
Barely fun cleaning up your shocking mess, by the way.
This, nosy. This is the multi-
Wrong dimension. Don't even get me started on Doctor Strange.
versus medicine.
Sorry, Captain. So you want me to handle this one, or? Huh, okay.
You know,
Nah, you gotta say it, Chris. Yeah, I already know.
Are you?
It's really corny. But
Do you say anything but no?
no. Yes.
Enough of this.
Hands in the air. On the ground.
Is it hands in the air or get down on the
You remain silent.
You don't understand.
You don't understand.
I've thought about it. I didn't hurt you.
Have you been lying to me?
Be my dad here and listen to me. You're in this to help. So am I.
You have the right
right? Dad, stop! Dad!
No further anomaly. Can't fix this.
Passion heads sticking on to adapt to this.
I know it's just a sophomore, but we want to get him here anymore.
Very serious. Come on, man.
I've been put. My mustache came in. You're good. Get up, get up, get up. God, it was
Are you serious? Consider it. Is it all coming back to you? You hit me with a bagel.
Me?
I lost my job.
Let me go.
You about to go?
Months is kind of a long time.
Where did you go? I'm in the zone. I'm having a journey. You feel empty. I have a hole inside of you. You were home. That doesn't stop you. We can't.
Unpermitted political action. You're calling yourself.
No one here thinks you're a joke.
Go with it. I'm not like you. Good music.
Everything for me.
Reporting for the moon.
Where's Claus? Show you really. You in the back?
Anomaly! The spider that gave you your powers! What? There's a world out there with one man!
There! You're lying!
It! You're before it going off. All this time! Go easy on it!
How to tell you?
Exactly what you are!
I guess he did find me how my story is supposed to go.
Entry signature identifier. They just got
You can't always say that.
you up there. Don't get lost his hands.
A machine.
Brooklyn is about to break. Beneath the vibrant comic book ink of Earth 1610, a teenage anomaly named Miles Morales is discovering that heroism isn't a choice, it's a collision. In a multiverse where 280 distinct variations of Spider-Man act as a biological containment system, one boy stands as a terminal error in the narrative pipeline. From the dripping, watercolor tears of Gwen Stacy's Manhattan to the brutalist, neo-futurist towers of Miguel O'Hara's 2099, the kinetic vectors of the Spider-Verse are shifting. This isn't just a sequel, it's a forensic audit of destiny. We are tracking the molecular instability of the canon, deconstructing the production friction that nearly shattered a studio and analyzing the physics of a chase that spans infinite realities. This is Spider-Man, Across the Spider-Verse, 2023. Gwen Stacy sits behind a 5-piece drum kit in a dimly lit attic space on Earth-65. She grips a pair of wooden sticks, striking the snare and cymbals with increasing force. The environment around her vibrates, bleeding into fluid shades of magenta and cyan as she releases internal psychological pressure. Her father, George Stacy, stands in the kitchen below, unaware of the structural secret his daughter maintains. Gwen hits the final crash cymbal, the sound echoing through the floorboards before she stares at the watercolor landscape of her bedroom. Flashback data confirms a catastrophic event at the Chelsea High School gymnasium. Peter Parker, suffering from biological mutation, transforms into a giant green lizard. Gwen Stacy, wearing her white and pink Spider-Woman suit, utilizes her wrist-mounted web shooters to restrain the creature. The impact of the struggle causes a heavy stone ceiling to fracture, raining debris onto the court. Peter reverts to human form, collapsing into Gwen's arms as his vital signs fail. Captain George Stacy enters the ruins with a 9mm service weapon drawn. He observes the vigilante standing over Peter's body, misidentifying the scenario as a homicide. Gwen swings through the circular mezzanine of the Guggenheim Museum. A sepia-toned Renaissance vulture emerges from a golden dimensional rift. This entity utilizes mechanical wooden wings and parchment flight surfaces. He grips a heavy iron-wrought statue with sharp talons, preparing to drop the object onto the lobby floor. Gwen fires a high-tensile web tether, anchoring the statue to a structural pillar. The vulture executes a dive bomb maneuver, using his wing-mounted quill projectiles to shatter the museum's glass display cases. Gwen deploys a web shield, absorbing the impact before pivoting into a counter-strike. A high-tech red hexagonal portal tears open the museum air. Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099, lunges forward with energized red talons. He wears a heavy-duty suit with a hard light web cape for aerodynamic steering. Miguel slams into the vulture, pinning him against the museum wall with superior physical mass. He activates a temporal wrist device to scan the sepia entity for dimensional displacement markers. The vulture uses his mechanical wings to strike Miguel, pushing the futuristic Spider-Man toward a fragile museum exhibit. Miguel deploys a laser grid web to contain the vulture's flight path, but the Renaissance villain uses a hidden blade to sever the light tether. A secondary portal releases Jess Drew on a heavy-framed motorcycle. She fires a volley of yellow bioelectric web bursts from her fingers while steering the vehicle vertically up a museum pillar. Jess uses the motorcycle's momentum to impact the vulture's flight mechanism. She deploys a specialized containment net from her wrist gauntlet, encapsulating the vulture's parchment wings. The villain struggles against the high-tensile strength of the Spider Society's containment tech. Miguel uses his brute force to drive the vulture toward the museum floor, while Jess provides suppressive web fire from the balcony. George Stacy enters the lower lobby, aiming his pistol at the center of Gwen's chest. He ignores the interdimensional threat, focusing his training on the arrest of the Spider-Woman. Gwen stands still as the watercolor environment shifts into a heavy, saturated red. She reaches for the hem of her mask, pulling the fabric away to reveal her face to her father. George's grip on the 9mm weapon remains steady despite the psychological shock of identifying his daughter as the target. He begins the formal arrest procedure, reading the legal rights while reaching for his metal handcuffs. Miguel O'Hara intervenes, deploying a temporal containment field that temporarily slows George's movement. Gwen stares at the handcuffs, then at her father's face, which is now a mask of professional duty. Miguel offers her a metallic wrist gizmo, a dimensional day pass that will allow her to leave Earth-65. Jess Drew nods, signaling the urgent need for evacuation before more law enforcement units arrive. Gwen takes the device, clicking it onto her wrist. A portal opens behind her, flickering with unstable white energy. She takes a final step away from George Stacy, her body dissolving into the rift as the museum lobby returns to its natural state. George stands alone in the wreckage, his weapon still aimed at the empty air where his daughter once stood. Miles Morales maneuvers through the urban infrastructure of Brooklyn, using a high-tensile web tether to adjust his kinetic vector. He carries a small plastic bag containing a cake for his father's promotion party. Gravity exerts a constant pull as he swings toward the Alchemax testing facility, seeking a metric for his current power calibration. He encounters Jonathan Owen, identified as the Spot, inside a local convenience store. The Spot attempts to extract a cash dispenser unit from the wall using a series of interdimensional portals. Miles fires a web strand at the cash unit, creating a counter-inertia that prevents the theft. The Spot inadvertently kicks his own leg through a portal, resulting in a self-inflicted strike to his abdominal section. Miles follows the Spot into the street, maintaining a steady velocity to match the villain's erratic displacement. The Spot creates a portal loop on the pavement, causing Miles to fall through a continuous spatial cycle. Miles calculates the exit trajectory, firing a web anchor at a street lamp to break the gravitational constraint. He uses his physical mass to tackle the Spot into a construction site. The Spot deploys multiple black portals across a stack of plywood, causing Miles' punches to pass through empty space and strike the plywood instead. This terminal error allows the Spot to escape toward a nearby rooftop. The Spot activates a flashback sequence in Miles' brain, revealing the infrastructure of the original Alchemax Collider explosion. Jonathan Owen was once a scientist asset working on the system state of the Kingpin's machine. During the event, Miles threw a bagel at the scientist's head, causing a minor physical displacement before the collider reached a terminal load. The resulting energy wave infused Owen's body with dark matter portals, erasing his civilian identity. Back in the present, the Spot attempts to jump into a small, unstable portal on the ground. He fails to calibrate the size, becoming stuck in the aperture. Miles pulls him out, but the Spot manages to kick Miles into a garbage container. The Spot discovers a way to utilize a portable mini-collider, gaining a new propulsive force. He vanishes from the Brooklyn sector, leaving Miles to deal with the biological fallout of the fight. Miles arrives at the Brooklyn Visions Academy, transitioning from his spider suit into civilian hardware. He enters the counselor's office where Jefferson and Rio Morales wait, their cognitive load visibly high. The counselor reviews a digital blueprint of Miles' academic performance, noting a significant decline in attendance metrics. Miles sits on a plastic chair, attempting to provide a logical explanation for his tardiness while concealing his dual identity hardware. A spider sense stimulus triggers a synaptic response in his brain, alerting him to a nearby threat. Jefferson's police radio emits a high-frequency signal, prompting him to exit the room to investigate a reported disturbance in the local sector. Rio stares at Miles, auditing his facial expressions for any sign of internal programming errors. Miles exits the building, leaving the academic audit behind. The Morales family gathers on a rooftop for Jefferson's captaincy celebration. Miles helps move a heavy grill, using his enhanced muscular logic to hide his physical superiority. He interacts with the party guests, their presence increasing his cognitive load as he tries to maintain his civilian persona. He finds himself alone on the rooftop edge, looking at the city's architectural grid. Gwen Stacy manifests in his room, her presence causing a shift in the room's chromatic saturation. Gwen examines Miles' sketchbook, noting the forensic detail of her own image. They exit through the window, climbing the side of the building to reach a high-altitude vantage point overlooking the city. Gwen explains her current assignment within the multiversal pipeline, highlighting the need for a strict calibration of dimensional stability. They swing through the Manhattan skyline, their kinetic vectors overlapping in a synchronized flight pattern. Gwen uses her wrist-mounted tethers to swing from a construction crane, while Miles uses a nearby building's specular glint as a guide for his next anchor point. They arrive at the top of the Williamsburg Bridge, sitting upside down to achieve a unique perspective on the city's light distribution. Gwen receives a signal on her temporal wrist device, indicating a displacement in the Mumbaton sector of Earth 50,101. She opens a portal using a high-energy key, and Miles discreetly follows her through the aperture. The transit involves a high-velocity displacement of Miles' physical mass. He lands on a bustling Mumbaton thoroughfare, where the air is thick with volumetric haze and a high density of civilian assets. Paviter Prabhakar appears, his suit featuring an anamorphic design that blends traditional and modern aesthetics. Paviter leads Miles and Gwen through a complex pipeline of suspended vehicles and high-rise structures. They reach the Alchemax Collider site, where the Spot is using a stolen piece of hardware to interface with the main power grid. The Spot's physical appearance has shifted. His white surface area is now covered in more concentrated black portals. He inserts a high-energy canister into the Collider's input port, initiating a thermal load sequence. Hobie Brown, also known as Spider-Punk, enters the tactical geometry of the lab. He carries a modified electric guitar that emits high-decibel sonic pulses, disrupting the spot's portal stability. Miles and Gwen coordinate a pincer maneuver, attempting to restrain the spot with dual web tethers. The spot activates the collider, causing a massive thermal load that begins to destabilize the room's molecular state. He absorbs the energy, his white surface area becoming saturated with dark matter. This increase in power causes a significant optical distortion in the immediate vicinity. Hobie uses a metal pipe as an improvised kinetic weapon, striking a security drone. The three spider assets engage the spot in a circular tactical geometry. Miles uses his Venom Strike ability, a bioelectric discharge that targets the spot's internal circuitry. The result is a massive energy release that destabilizes the room's gravitational constraint. The spot's body undergoes a complete structural transformation, turning into a pitch-black void of pure energy. He speaks with an amplified audio frequency, promising to erase everything Miles loves. He vanishes through a giant portal, leaving the Alchemax Tower in a state of terminal structural failure. The building's support infrastructure begins to liquefy due to the collider's radiation. Miles observes a sensory stimulus, a pre-calculated vision of Inspector Singh's death. He breaks away from the fight, aiming his ballistic trajectory toward the falling masonry of a nearby bridge. He deploys a series of web nets to catch a falling bus, using his inertia to redirect the vehicle away from the civilian population. Gwen and Paviter work to secure the upper levels of the bridge, while Hobie uses his sonic hardware to shatter falling concrete blocks. Miles reaches the site where Inspector Singh is attempting to rescue a child. The building's support beams reach a terminal stress point, snapping with a high-decibel crack. Miles fires 4 web strands at the falling debris, using his physical strength as a counterbalance to the gravitational pull. He pulls Singh and the child clear of the impact zone, creating a deviation from the predetermined narrative blueprint. The immediate result is a localized reality collapse. A black, geometric void spreads through the streets of Mumbaton, erasing the architecture. The Spider Society's containment unit, led by a group of armored assets, arrives to deploy cannon stabilizers, large, glowing pylons that project a corrective energy field into the environment. Jessica Drew arrives on her motorcycle, looking at Miles with a cold, diagnostic expression. She orders the Spider assets to evacuate to the Spider Society hub for an immediate forensic audit. The group enters a massive, multi-layered portal that transports them to Earth 928. They arrive at the New York headquarters, a neo-futurist megastructure built with brutalist architectural logic. Thousands of spider people move through the corridors, their different animation styles creating a high cognitive load for Miles. They pass through a decontamination chamber where a laser grid audits their molecular stability. Miles sees Peter B. Parker, who is now carrying a baby in a specialized chest carrier. Peter introduces Mayday Parker, his biological offspring who already exhibits wall-crawling hardware. They enter a large elevator, ascending toward the command deck where Miguel O'Hara monitors the multiverse pipeline. The lift doors open to reveal a massive holographic map of the Spider-Verse, showing the interconnected web of reality. Miguel O'Hara stands in the center of the room, his red talons extended as he analyzes a terminal error on a digital display. He turns toward Miles, his face illuminated by the specular glint of the holographic data. Miguel begins a forensic deconstruction of the multiverse's logic. He projects a holographic image of a canon event, explaining that certain narrative markers must occur to maintain the system state of each universe. He shows a sequence of a police captain dying while saving a child, highlighting it as a mandatory metric for every Spider-Man. Miles realizes that his intervention in Mumbaton has jeopardized the entire multiversal infrastructure. Miguel reveals that the Spot is heading toward Earth 1610 to kill Jefferson Morales, who is scheduled to become a police captain in 2 days. This upcoming event is a critical canon marker. Miles attempts to leave the room to save his father, but Miguel activates a magnetic floor lock, trapping Miles in place. The Spider Society assets move into a circular formation, preparing to restrain the anomaly. Hobie Brown disrupts the room's internal programming by handing Gwen a modified portal device. He quits the Spider Society, jumping through a portal of his own creation. Miles uses his Venom Blast to short-circuit the magnetic floor lock, creating a propulsive force that launches him toward the ceiling. He maneuvers through the structural beams of the command deck, avoiding the web fire of the pursuit team. Miguel O'Hara lunges after him, his red cape creating a blurred kinetic vector in the low-light environment. Miles reaches the exterior of the building, standing on the edge of a vertical drop that extends for miles into the New York cityscape. He looks back at the army of spider people closing in on his position, his internal sensors reaching a state of peak synaptic response. He leaps into the volumetric haze, initiating a high-speed chase through the city's vertical pipeline. The pursuit team deploys specialized capture hardware, including drones and high-speed web grapples. Miles uses the city's transit system as a tactical shield, weaving between floating trains to disrupt the pursuer's line of sight. He manages to reach the go-home machine, a massive circular device designed to scan an asset's DNA and return them to their original dimension. Miles enters the scan zone, his molecular structure being audited by the machine's laser sensors. Margot Kess, the Spider-Bite asset, monitors the control console. She observes Miguel O'Hara screaming for the machine to be deactivated, but she hesitates, allowing the calibration sequence to complete. Miles' body begins to dissolve into a stream of digital data as the machine reaches its final energy threshold. Miguel slams into the containment field just as the teleportation occurs. Miles vanishes from Earth 928, leaving a trail of unstable energy behind, as he heads toward what he believes is his home reality. Miles Morales exits the dimensional pipeline and lands in a bedroom that mimics his own Earth 1610 blueprints. He observes the internal architecture, noting subtle differences in the Kelvin scale of the room's lighting. He approaches the Rio Morales asset, who is folding laundry. Miles attempts to explain his emotional load and his dual identity hardware, but his internal sensors detect a terminal error in the social interaction. The Rio variant expresses confusion regarding the identity of Spider-Man, indicating a complete absence of the vigilante in this urban infrastructure. Miles looks at a family photo, noticing the biological absence of his father, Jefferson Morales. He realizes the go-home machine scanned his DNA, but calibrated his destination based on the origin of the spider that bit him, not his home reality. He is currently a displaced asset on Earth 42. Miles moves to the window, observing the Mumbaton-like decay of the New York skyline. The city lacks the organized security of his home reality, showing a high density of criminal activity and a lack of superhero intervention. He hears a door open behind him. Uncle Aaron enters the room, wearing a leather jacket and carrying a bag of supplies. Miles experiences a high synaptic response, as the Aaron asset of his own world is deceased. He follows Aaron to the rooftop, attempting to recalibrate his relationship with this variant. Aaron moves with a different kinetic vector, his body language suggesting a history of combat friction. They stand on the edge of the building, looking at the crime-ridden streets. Miles tries to reveal his secret programming, but Aaron interrupts, sensing an external threat in the tactical geometry of the roof. Aaron strikes Miles with a heavy punch, knocking him toward a mechanical structure. He utilizes a heavy-duty metal chain to restrain Miles' wrists, anchoring him to a structural punching bag frame. Miles struggles against the iron hardware, but his physical mass is limited by the positioning of the chains. Aaron questions the Miles asset about his origin and his intentions. Miles attempts to use his Venom Blast to short-circuit the chains, but his internal power cells are low on energy. A shadow moves in the background, a new kinetic presence entering the frame. A figure in high-tech purple and chrome armor descends from the higher levels of the rooftop. The figure removes a metallic mask, revealing the Earth 42 version of Miles Morales. This variant has been programmed as the Prowler, functioning as a tactical enforcer in a world without a Spider-Man. On Earth 65, Spider-Woman Gwen Stacy has become increasingly isolated from her friends and estranged from her father, George. George is hunting Spider-Woman for killing Peter Parker, unaware that it was an accident after Peter turned into the lizard. Gwen Stacy returns to her primary residence. The environment shifts into a high-saturation watercolor palette, reflecting her internal biological fallout. She enters through the window, finding her father, George Stacy, sitting in the dark. George holds his service weapon, but his kinetic posture is defensive, not aggressive. He reveals that he has resigned from the police force, effectively breaking the canon event blueprint that required his death as a captain. This total system state reset allows for a reconciliation between the two assets. George hands Gwen a makeshift portal device left behind by Hobie Brown. Gwen activates the hardware, the high-energy frequency cutting through the room's chromatic haze. She initiates a search grid to locate Miles, jumping into the multiversal pipeline with a new objective. Gwen arrives on Earth 1610, landing in Miles' bedroom. She interacts with Jefferson and Rio Morales, who are searching for their son after the disruption at the promotion party. Gwen uses her forensic training to audit the room for any signs of Miles' recent presence. She realizes that Miles is not in this dimension. She promises the parents that she will locate the biological asset and return him to his home sector. Gwen exits the window, deploying a web tether to reach a high-altitude position. She activates the Hobitech portal, calling for backup from a pre-vetted list of Spider Society defectors. She needs a team that operates outside the logic of Miguel O'Hara's canon system. Back on Earth 42, the Prowler Miles asset approaches his captive counterpart. He uses a mechanical gauntlet to check Miles' vital signs and power levels. The tactical geometry of the roof is now an interrogation cell. Miles 1610 begins to charge his bioelectric cells, the blue energy creating a specular glint on the metal chains. He calculates the thermal load required to melt the hardware. He looks directly at the Prowler, his facial muscles tightening as he prepares for a high-velocity escape maneuver. He realizes that his existence as an anomaly is the key to disrupting the deterministic programming of the multiverse. The spot reaches a state of peak energy saturation on Earth 1610. His body is no longer a biological vessel, but a void of pure interdimensional force. He stands in front of the Morales apartment, his presence causing a localized optical distortion. He begins to deploy thousands of black portals across the city's infrastructure, preparing for a terminal strike against the population. The environmental sensors of the city begin to fail as the spot's dark matter begins to displace the air's molecular density. The scale of the threat reaches a level of multiversal catastrophe, requiring an immediate response from all available Spider assets. Gwen's rescue team assembles within the portal's energy field. Peter B. Parker enters the frame, still carrying the Mayday asset, who is now equipped with her own small web shooters. Paviter Prabhakar, Hobie Brown, and Margot Kess join the formation. The team is further augmented by the arrival of Spider-Man Noir, who brings a monochromatic aesthetic to the tactical group. Penny Parker arrives in a new, larger SB unit, while Spider-Ham provides additional kinetic support. This group represents a diverse cross-section of the multiverse's defensive architecture. Gwen leads the team through the portal, their kinetic vectors aligned toward Earth 42. They move with high propulsive force, their collective objective being the retrieval of the Miles Morales asset before the Prowler can execute a terminal strike. Miles 1610 completes his power calibration. The blue bioelectric energy flows from his chest into his arms, creating a massive thermal load on the metal chains. The hardware begins to glow orange before reaching a melting point. He looks at his Earth 42 counterpart, his eyes glowing with the intensity of his venom blast. He breaks the chains with a high-decibel snap, the kinetic force pushing the Prowler back toward the edge of the roof. Miles lunges forward, his body becoming a blur of motion as he initiates a counterattack. The screen cuts to black as the energy reaches a state of peak saturation, leaving the narrative in a state of unresolved friction. The multiverse is now in a state of total war, with the anomaly leading the charge against destiny itself. Identifying Project Entity as Spider-Man, Across the Spider-Verse, released in the year 2023. This production functions as a primary sequel to the 2018 baseline, Into the Spider-Verse. The fiscal pipeline required a budget calibration between $100 million and $150 million. The architectural success of the previous installment triggered the development of this expanded infrastructure, aiming for a broader multiversal scope. The distribution pipeline is managed by Columbia Pictures and Sony Pictures Animation, operating in association with Marvel Entertainment. The project is categorized under the genre metrics of animated superhero science fiction, utilizing a high-fidelity system state to push the boundaries of current animation hardware. The directing architecture consists of a 3-unit leadership structure including Joaquim Dos Santos, Kemp Powers, and Justin K. Thompson. This directorial pipeline ensures that the 6 visited universes maintain distinct chromatic saturation levels and unique optical distortion patterns. The screenplay is the result of a logic-driven collaboration between the writing team of Phil Lord, Christopher Miller, and Dave Callahan. Lord and Miller also serve as primary producers, overseeing the calibration of the story beats to ensure narrative stability across the complex multiversal blueprint. This leadership group managed a staff infrastructure of over 1,000 personnel, representing the largest crew ever assigned to an animated project. Biological asset Shameik Moore provides the vocal hardware for the lead character, Miles Morales. Moore's vocal frequencies allow for a measurable maturation metric, reflecting the character's growth spurt and increased cognitive load since the 2018 incident. Miles Morales' asset operates as the central anomaly within the Spider-Verse pipeline. Hailee Steinfeld serves as the vocal asset for Gwen Stacy, also known as Spider-Woman. Steinfeld's performance is calibrated to match the watercolor Kelvin scale of Earth 65, conveying a sense of isolation and internal psychological friction. The interaction between the Moore asset and the Steinfeld asset forms the primary behavioral stimulus for the film's narrative progression. Antagonist hardware is provided by biological asset Jason Schwartzman, who voices Jonathan Owen, identified as the Spot. The Spot functions as a scientific terminal error, his body covered in interdimensional portals that allow for instantaneous spatial displacement. Schwartzman's vocal delivery transitions from a state of low-level incompetence to a high-energy threat as the character absorbs more dark matter energy. The Spot's origin is directly linked to the Alchemax Collider incident in the previous film, creating a logical feedback loop within the plot skeleton. This character represents the primary kinetic vector that forces the Spider Society to initiate an emergency audit of the multiverse. The parental infrastructure for the Miles Morales asset is voiced by Brian Tyree Henry and Lauren Velez. Henry provides the vocal calibration for Jefferson Morales, a police officer whose recent promotion to captain acts as a critical canon event marker. Velez voices Rio Morales, whose maternal diagnostic behavior provides a stabilizing influence on Miles' chaotic life. These biological assets are essential for establishing the high emotional stakes of the story, as their safety becomes the primary objective for Miles. The forensic deconstruction of the Morales family dynamic reveals a high level of communication friction caused by Miles' secret dual-identity hardware. The elite leadership of the Spider Society is voiced by Oscar Isaac and Issa Rae. Isaac provides the vocal hardware for Miguel O'Hara, also known as Spider-Man 2099. Miguel is the architect of the Spider Society, a ninja vampire variant whose behavioral stimulus is driven by past trauma and a rigid adherence to multiversal logic. Isaac's deep, authentic vocal frequencies convey a sense of authoritarian pressure and psychological load. Issa Rae voices Jess Drew, a pregnant Spider-Woman who serves as Miguel's primary tactical enforcer. Jess Drew operates a heavy motorcycle with high-speed kinetic vectors, utilizing a yellow bioelectric web burst as her primary capture hardware. Additional biological assets include Daniel Kaluuya and Karen Sony, who provide the vocal frequencies for Hobie Brown and Paviter Prabhakar. Kaluuya's performance as Spider-Punk is calibrated with a specific anti-establishment logic, his animation style mimicking a 70s-era punk rock collage. Kaluuya's vocal delivery uses a rhythmic, song-like cadence to emphasize the character's anarchic personality. Karen Sony voices Paviter Prabhakar, the Spider-Man of Mumbattan. Paviter's optimism acts as a behavioral counterpoint to Miguel O'Hara's cold, diagnostic style. Both assets provide critical support during the Mumbattan sector battle, helping Miles and Gwen navigate the complex vertical pipeline of Earth 5101. Jake Johnson reprises his role as Peter B. Parker, providing the vocal hardware for an older, more experienced Spider-Man. Peter B. Parker now carries a biological offspring named Mayday, whose presence introduces a new layer of cognitive load to his character arc. Peter's role is to act as a moderator between Miles and Miguel, though he is currently caught between his loyalty to his student and his responsibilities to the Spider Society's system state. Peter B. Parker's bathrobe and infant carrier hardware act as visual indicators of his transitioned life status. The technical infrastructure of the film required the development of 6 distinct animation styles, each mapped to a specific universe's blueprint. Sony Pictures Imageworks utilized advanced simulation hardware to emulate watercolor paintings, neo-futurist illustrations, and punk rock zines. The optical architecture of the project involves varying frame rates and anamorphic lens emulation to create a high-fidelity visual experience. The Kelvin scale and chromatic saturation are precisely calibrated in each scene to reflect the emotional state of the characters. This forensic attention to detail ensures that the audience remains engaged with the complex multiversal geometry without experiencing visual fatigue or cognitive overload. Final metrics for the fiscal pipeline indicate a worldwide gross exceeding $690 million. This represents a significant growth yield compared to the $384 million earned by the previous installment. The film has been audited by multiple awarding bodies, receiving a nomination for Best Animated Feature at the 96th Academy Awards. The critical response has been universally positive, with high scores recorded on all major review aggregators. Spider-Man: Across the Spider-Verse has successfully established a new metric for animated storytelling, proving that the superhero genre can support high-level narrative complexity and innovative optical hardware. The project ends with a forward-facing momentum, setting the stage for the third entry in the trilogy, Beyond the Spider-Verse. The directorial infrastructure of this production is managed through a 3-unit leadership pipeline consisting of Joaquim Dos Santos, Kemp Powers, and Justin K. Thompson. This triumvirate operates as the central processing unit for the film's narrative and visual system state. Each director brings a specialized technical metric to the assembly line. Dos Santos, with a background in high-velocity kinetic sequences, oversees the ballistic trajectory of the action hardware. Powers, an expert in behavioral diagnostics and character-driven logic, calibrates the internal programming of the Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy assets. Thompson, transitioning from production design architecture, ensures the structural integrity of the 6 distinct universes visited within the 90-minute timeline. This leadership group managed a staff infrastructure of over 1,000 personnel, the largest crew ever calibrated for an animated project. Their primary directive is to ensure that the varying animation hardware does not result in a terminal error of visual overload or cognitive fatigue for the viewer. In the Earth 65 prologue, the directorial logic is evident in the watercolor Kelvin scale of Gwen Stacy's environment. As Gwen strikes her drum hardware, the vibration metrics are calculated to reflect her internal psychological displacement. The directors utilize a high-fidelity simulator to generate the impressionistic style, where the chromatic saturation shifts according to Gwen's emotional load. During the Guggenheim Museum battle, Dos Santos calibrates the focal length to capture the Renaissance vulture's mechanical flight patterns. The vulture's design is a forensic deconstruction of Leonardo da Vinci's technical blueprints, utilizing wooden gears and parchment flight surfaces. The directors ensure that the interaction between Gwen's modern web tethers and the vulture's archaic weaponry creates a measurable kinetic friction. This sequence serves as a diagnostic tool, establishing the multiversal displacement that drives the plot forward. The transition to Earth 1610 in Brooklyn reveals the behavioral stimulus directed by Kemp Powers. During the convenience store encounter with the Spot, the directorial logic audits the physical comedy through a series of portal-based displacement events. The Spot's body, a white surface area covered in unstable black portals, is a challenging piece of visual hardware. The directors utilize a sketch-like animation style for the Spot, with blue construction lines remaining visible to emulate a comic book artist's rough draft. This calibration reflects the character's low-level threat state at the beginning of the film. Powers ensures that Miles' reaction to the Spot, a mix of confusion and overconfidence, is tracked through precise facial micro-movements. The logistics of the bagel flashback function as a forensic link to the previous film's collider infrastructure, proving that the directorial team is highly focused on narrative continuity. During the rooftop celebration for Jefferson Morales, the directors calibrate a high level of communication friction. The interaction between Miles and his parents is a critical piece of the film's social architecture. Powers and Thompson use a specific lens axis to create a sense of intimacy and depth of field, highlighting the emotional load carried by the Morales family. The arrival of the Gwen Stacy asset triggers a shift in the room's chromatic saturation, signaling a disruption in Miles' civilian programming. The directorial trio manages the transition from a family drama to a high-altitude swing through the Manhattan skyline. They utilize a virtual handheld camera rig to simulate the inertia and velocity of the characters as they navigate the urban grid. The specular glint on the buildings and the volumetric haze of the city are carefully balanced to maintain a high-fidelity visual experience without causing optical distortion. In the Mumbaton sector of Earth 5101, Justin K. Thompson's architectural logic takes the lead. The blueprint for Mumbaton utilizes an anamorphic lens emulation to create a high-density vertical pipeline of suspended vehicles and skyscrapers. The directors manage a complex array of kinetic vectors as Miles, Gwen, and Paviter Prabhakar engage the spot. The spot's transformation, as he absorbs the power of the Mumbaton collider, is a high-energy thermal load sequence. The directors utilize a mix of frame rates, animating some assets on ones and others on twos, to create a unique synaptic response. This technique emphasizes the anarchic personality of Spider-Punk, whose collage-style animation hardware disrupts the visual consistency of the scene. The structural failure of the Alchemax Tower is a forensic masterpiece of physics-based destruction, requiring a massive amount of computational hardware to render correctly. The directors manage the canon event, Diagnostic, within the New York sector of Earth 928. This brutalist megastructure reflects the cold, authoritarian logic of Miguel O'Hara. The directorial triumvirate utilizes a minimalist design architecture to contrast with the vibrant chaos of the previous universes. Miguel's command deck is a highly controlled environment, where holographic maps of the Spider-Verse display the interconnected narrative pipelines. The directors calibrate Oscar Isaac's vocal frequencies to match Miguel's rigid internal programming. The forensic deconstruction of the canon, revealed in this sequence, is a meta-commentary on the rules of superhero storytelling. The directors ensure that the moral friction between Miles' desire for autonomy and Miguel's adherence to the system state is the primary driver of the final act's velocity. As Miles initiates his escape from the Spider Society hub, the directors deploy a high-velocity kinetic vector for the pursuit. This sequence, known as the Great Chase, involves hundreds of unique Spider assets, each requiring a specific animation calibration. The directorial logic handles the ballistic trajectory of thousands of web strands and gravity-defying maneuvers. They utilize the city's vertical transit pipeline as a tactical geometry, forcing the characters to adapt to rapidly shifting environments. The directors work with the visual effects team to ensure that the chromatic saturation and lens axis remain stable during the high-speed displacement. This chase is not just an action sequence. It is a terminal stress test for the film's animation infrastructure, proving that the three-unit leadership can manage extreme levels of technical complexity. The directorial triumvirate collaborates with the cinematography department to emulate specific film stocks and lens characteristics. They utilize a restyled digital sensor logic for the Brooklyn scenes to achieve a naturalistic Kelvin scale. In contrast, the New York sectors use a sharper, more clinical optical architecture. The directors also experiment with the depth of field to focus the viewer's attention on specific tactical moments, such as Margot Kess hesitating at the go-home machine console. This forensic attention to optical detail enhances the film's immersion, making the multiversal transit feel like a physical displacement rather than a simple visual transition. The directors ensure that the go-home machine calibration sequence is the climax of the film's technical and narrative logic. The final sector of the 90-minute timeline involves Miles' arrival on Earth 42. The directors utilize a significant shift in the environmental Kelvin scale to signal a dark matter-saturated reality. The New York of Earth 42 is a crime-ridden urban infrastructure lacking a Spider-Man defensive asset. The directorial logic here is to create a sense of terminal error and biological fallout. The interaction between Miles and the Prowler variant is directed as a high-friction psychological audit. The directors end this segment with a forward propulsive force, utilizing a cliffhanger to maintain audience engagement for the next entry in the pipeline. This final diagnostic confirms that the Dos Santos, Powers, and Thompson leadership architecture has successfully delivered one of the most technically ambitious projects in the history of the medium. Production records indicate that the directors faced significant friction during the multi-year development cycle. The need to recalibrate entire sequences late in the pipeline resulted in high levels of overtime for the animation staff. Despite these infrastructure challenges, the directorial triumvirate maintained a high standard of quality control. Their ability to balance the physics of the action with the cognitive load of the story is the primary reason for the film's success. The directors have successfully created a multiversal blueprint that is both structurally sound and visually revolutionary. The cumulative result is a film that functions as a high-fidelity diagnostic of the current state of animation, setting a new metric for all future projects in the sector. The fiscal pipeline for this production required an initial investment metric between $100 million and $150 million. This financial infrastructure was necessary to support a staff architecture of over 1,000 personnel, representing a massive cognitive load on the Sony Pictures animation budget. The directorial trio of Dos Santos, Powers, and Thompson managed this capital as a propulsive force to achieve the high-fidelity visual system state required for a multiversal narrative. Industry analysts performed a pre-release audit, projecting an opening weekend yield of $80 million. However, the actual data recorded a significant deviation from these metrics. On the launch date of June 2, 2023, the domestic market generated an opening velocity of $120.7 million. This result established a new benchmark for the franchise, indicating a high level of consumer engagement with the Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy assets. The financial diagnostic of the opening weekend reveals a domestic yield that nearly doubled the $51.7 million opening of the 2018 baseline. This growth metric proves that the Spider-Verse brand has successfully expanded its market share within the superhero genre. The production utilized a high-energy marketing pipeline, including a partnership with Hyundai Motor Company to showcase new vehicle hardware within the film's urban infrastructure. This collaboration provided an auxiliary revenue stream and reduced the net fiscal friction for the studio. Additionally, the Spider-Verse Whopper campaign with Burger King acted as a behavioral stimulus for younger demographics, driving ticket sales through cross-platform consumer interaction. These marketing kinetic vectors were precisely calibrated to peak during the final transition from the second to the third act. The global distribution pipeline for Earth 65 and Earth 1610 involved 59 unique international markets. During the first 7 days of the release cycle, the international sectors generated $88.1 million. The forensic deconstruction of these returns shows that China was the primary contributor to the international fiscal yield, providing $49.6 million. The UK market followed with $35 million, while Mexico recorded a revenue metric of $27.8 million. This international data confirms that the animated Spider-Man hardware has a high level of universal compatibility across different cultural architectures. The fiscal stability of the project was further reinforced by the high retention rate of audiences, with only a 44% drop in revenue during the second weekend of the release cycle. Sony Pictures Animation implemented a specific pricing logic for premium large-format screenings and IMAX theaters. Although the film lacked a 3D release metric, the high demand for IMAX screens provided a significant boost to the per-theater average revenue. The optical architecture of the film, featuring a wide anamorphic aspect ratio and complex chromatic saturation, acted as a primary driver for audiences to seek out high-resolution projection hardware. This strategy maximized the ticket yield while minimizing the technical friction of 3D glasses. The forensic audit of the domestic box office confirms that Across the Spider-Verse became the third highest-grossing film of 2023 in the United States, outperforming several live-action tentpole productions with larger budget architectures. A critical component of the financial infrastructure was the secondary revenue pipeline generated through digital and physical merchandising. The Nike collaboration, featuring a special iteration of the Air Jordan 1 High OG, utilized the film's visual blueprint as a marketing asset. This hardware sold out within minutes of its release, creating a specular glint of hype that increased the film's cultural velocity. Epic Games further amplified the brand equity by integrating Miles Morales and Miguel O'Hara skins into the Fortnite system state. This digital displacement allowed millions of users to interact with the characters outside the theater environment, creating a continuous feedback loop of brand awareness. These partnerships act as a stabilizing force for the franchise's long-term fiscal health. The net profit calculation for this production involves a complex diagnostic of theatrical revenue, home media sales, and streaming licensing fees. Deadline Hollywood performed a forensic audit, placing the net profit at $328 million after factoring in all production and marketing costs. This profit metric places Across the Spider-Verse as the third most valuable blockbuster of 2023. The Pay-1 window streaming rights were licensed to Netflix in an 18-month agreement, while the Pay-2 window rights were secured by Disney for broadcast on Disney Plus and Hulu. These licensing pipelines ensure a consistent revenue flow long after the theatrical release reaches its terminal point. The financial success of this project has secured the budget calibration for the upcoming sequel, Beyond the Spider-Verse. The fiscal success in the Mumbai sector and the New York command deck confirms that the project's high budget was a necessary investment for its structural complexity. The forensic deconstruction of the box office performance reveals that the film's innovation in animation hardware directly correlated with its financial yields. Audiences demonstrated a high tolerance for the cognitive load of the multiversal story, provided the visual delivery remained at a high-fidelity level. The film's ability to maintain a steady revenue velocity, despite competition from Transformers, and The Flash proves its dominant position within the summer release pipeline. The cumulative worldwide gross of $690.8 million is a testament to the efficient management of the film's fiscal kinetic energy. Final metrics show that Across the Spider-Verse has overtaken The Smurfs to become the highest-grossing film in the history of the Sony Pictures animation studio. This record-breaking yield has altered the studio's long-term business blueprint, shifting the focus toward more complex and high-budget animated projects. The forensic audit of the film's reception indicates a 95% positive score from critics, which translates into a long tail for home media revenue. The stability of the Spider-Verse system state is now a primary asset for Sony's entertainment sector. The financial diagnostic confirms that the project has achieved a state of total market saturation, ensuring its place as a cornerstone of the modern cinematic architecture. The transition from the second to the third act in the movie coincides with the film's peak theatrical performance. As Miles Morales maneuvers through the New York vertical pipeline, the box office data mirrored this upward velocity. The production's ability to avoid the terminal error of sequel fatigue is a key diagnostic marker for future franchise planning. The fiscal architecture was designed with a three-part trilogy logic, ensuring that the cliffhanger ending serves as a propulsive force for the next entry's opening weekend. The total financial yield of this production has validated the director's high-friction approach to animation, proving that technical risk can result in a high-velocity return on investment. The project has successfully calibrated the intersection of art and commerce within a 90-minute narrative grid. In conclusion, the box office forensics for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse indicate a highly successful management of capital and brand equity. The $150 million budget was transformed into a $690 million global asset through a series of precisely timed marketing kinetic vectors and a high-fidelity visual delivery. The forensic audit of the project's financial system state reveals no significant logic errors or fiscal leaks. The production has achieved its primary goal of providing a massive return on investment while expanding the architectural boundaries of the superhero genre. The final data points confirm that the Miles Morales anomaly is not just a narrative error, but a powerful engine for economic growth within the Sony Pictures animation pipeline. The corporate infrastructure governing this project is anchored by a complex distribution pipeline managed through Sony Pictures Releasing. This entity operates as the primary delivery system for the global market, ensuring the narrative hardware reaches infinite civilian assets across the planet. The production architecture is a multi-layered coalition consisting of Columbia Pictures and Sony Pictures Animation, functioning in a strategic alliance with Marvel Entertainment. Additional support hardware is provided by Arad Productions, Lord Miller, and Pascal Pictures. This group of entities managed the 5-year development cycle, starting from the initial buzz of the 2018 baseline and reaching a terminal release date on June 2, 2023. The forensic audit of this corporate network reveals a highly efficient capital allocation system designed to maximize the brand equity of the Miles Morales anomaly. Moving through the diagnostic of the distribution logic, it is clear that the project was calibrated for a massive theatrical footprint, utilizing 59 international markets to achieve a peak fiscal velocity. The production pipeline for Earth 65 and Earth 1610 required a staff infrastructure exceeding 1,000 specialized personnel. This represents the highest human resource metric ever recorded for an animated assembly line. Much of the rendering hardware and technical execution was processed at Sony Pictures Imageworks in Vancouver. This facility served as the primary command deck for the animation logic, where lead animator Nick Kondo initiated the production sequence in June 2020. The architectural blueprint for the film's 6 universes demanded the creation of new animation tools and simulation software to avoid terminal errors in the visual delivery. This technological pipeline allowed the directors to experiment with varying frame rates and optical distortion patterns without compromising the structural integrity of the project. The Imageworks facility functioned as a high-fidelity laboratory for the development of the watercolor Kelvin scale and the neo-futurist architecture seen in New York. Moving to the diagnostic of the Lord Miller production entity, the forensic deconstruction reveals their role as the primary narrative architects. Phil Lord and Christopher Miller served as a dual-unit leadership core, overseeing the screenplay calibration alongside Dave Callahan. Their internal programming focused on expanding the story into a 2-part narrative infrastructure, realizing that the cognitive load of the complete script was too heavy for a single cinematic vessel. This logical decision led to the split between Across the Spider-Verse and the upcoming Beyond the Spider-Verse. The Lord Miller entity also managed the friction between the creative team and the studio, ensuring that the innovation in animation hardware remained a top priority. Their ability to balance the physics of the action with the behavioral stimulus of the characters is a key metric in the film's critical and financial success. Marvel Entertainment's participation in the corporate blueprint provides a forensic link to the broader superhero ecosystem. While the project operates within a Sony-controlled pipeline, the integration of Marvel assets ensures a high level of brand recognition. The presence of archival footage featuring Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield acts as a cross-platform data patch, linking the animated multiverse to previous live-action iterations. This distribution logic increases the film's cultural velocity, appealing to multiple generations of consumers. The Marvel Audit confirms that the Miles Morales asset is a critical component of the company's long-term intellectual property pipeline. The inclusion of the Spider Society, featuring hundreds of unique variants, functions as a massive data dump of comic book lore, precisely calibrated to trigger a positive synaptic response in dedicated fans. The fiscal pipeline for the project was further reinforced by a series of high-energy licensing agreements. Sony signed a pay-one-window streaming contract with Netflix, creating an 18-month exclusivity cycle for the digital delivery of the film. This was followed by a pay-two-window agreement with Disney, allowing the project to be audited on Disney Plus and Hulu. These contracts function as a continuous revenue pipeline, ensuring that the capital invested in the production is recovered long after the theatrical run reaches its terminal point. The forensic audit of these rights management systems shows a highly calculated strategy to saturate all available media channels. By diversifying the distribution hardware, the studio minimized the risk of fiscal friction and maximized the long-term brand stability. Auxiliary tactical assets were deployed through promotional partnerships with global corporations. Hyundai Motor Company utilized the film's urban infrastructure as a showcase for their future vehicle blueprints, integrating their electric hardware into the Mumbai and New York sectors. This partnership acted as a propulsive force for the film's marketing, providing high-visibility kinetic vectors in the real-world environment. Burger King's Spider-Verse Whopper campaign provided a behavioral stimulus for the fast food demographic, utilizing a red bun aesthetic to match the film's chromatic saturation. These marketing partnerships were not merely supplemental. They were integrated into the overall distribution logic to ensure a state of total market saturation. The forensic deconstruction of these campaigns reveals a high level of coordination between the film's visual style and the partner's product architecture. The auditory diagnostic for the project is managed by composer Daniel Pemberton, who returned to calibrate the score's frequencies. Pemberton utilized a wide range of audio hardware, including 80-era synthesizers and scratch DJ techniques, to create a unique auditory signature for each universe. The score functions as an auditory guide through the multiversal transit, using different musical metrics to reflect the Kelvin scale and kinetic energy of the scenes. Metro Boomin was recruited to curate the soundtrack hardware, bringing in high-profile biological assets like 21 Savage and Future to increase the film's cultural velocity. The forensic audit of the sound design shows a highly precise calibration of Foley effects and music to prevent audio fatigue. This auditory pipeline is essential for maintaining the viewer's cognitive focus during the high-speed chases through the vertical pipelines of New York. Moving through the corporate audit of the cast, we find a high density of high-value biological assets. Shameik Moore and Hailee Steinfeld are the primary data points, but the supporting cast includes Academy Award-winning assets like Daniel Kaluuya and Mahershala Ali. The vocal hardware provided by Oscar Isaac for Miguel O'Hara is particularly notable for its deep, authentic frequency, which perfectly matches the character's authoritarian internal programming. The recruitment of these assets was a logical decision to ensure a high level of performance fidelity. The forensic deconstruction of the voice acting pipeline reveals that many of the actors recorded their dialogue over several years, allowing for multiple iterations and recalibrations of the narrative logic. This high-friction approach to casting ensures that the emotional load of the story is delivered with maximum impact. The distribution hardware for the project also included a manga spin-off titled Spider-Man: Octo-Girl, which began serialization in June 2023. This cross-media displacement allows the brand to penetrate the Japanese market with a high level of efficiency. The manga functions as a parallel data track, expanding the Spider-Verse architecture into new narrative sectors. This diversification of the content pipeline is a key metric in Sony's global strategy for the franchise. The forensic audit of the manga's performance shows a high level of engagement from the target demographic, further solidifying the brand's presence in the international sector. This strategy of multi-platform saturation ensures that the Miles Morales anomaly remains a dominant force in the global entertainment ecosystem. Final metrics for the production's corporate infrastructure confirm a state of total success. The alliance between Sony, Columbia, and Marvel has created a structurally sound and financially robust system state. The forensic audit of the project's distribution logic shows no significant logic errors or fiscal leaks. The 90-minute narrative grid has been successfully delivered to millions of civilian assets, generating a massive yield for all stakeholders. The forward-facing momentum of the project is now focused on the 2027 release window for the final entry in the trilogy. The corporate pipeline is already being calibrated for the next high-velocity launch, ensuring that the Spider-Verse architecture remains at the peak of the industry's technical and financial metrics. The diagnostic is complete. The project is a terminal success in the forensic history of cinema. As the movie timeline approaches the 90-minute mark, the corporate and production data aligns with the on-screen action. The high-speed chase through Miguel O'Hara's New York hub is a visual representation of the project's high-octane growth metrics. The kinetic vectors of the animation staff's hard work, the fiscal load of the studio's investment, and the behavioral stimulus of the marketing campaigns all collide in this final act. The forensic deconstruction of the project's infrastructure reveals a machine that is functioning at peak efficiency. Every technical metric, from the Kelvin scale of the lighting to the propulsive force of the soundtrack, has been audited and verified for maximum quality. The result is a high-fidelity cinematic experience that has redefined the architectural boundaries of the animated medium. The data is clear. Across the Spider-Verse has reached a state of total multiversal saturation. The character progression of the Miles Morales asset is a forensic study in narrative displacement and internal programming resets. Moving from the 2018 baseline on Earth 1610, Miles has reached a physiological state of maturation that increases his kinetic output by 60%. His current psychological infrastructure is defined by a high cognitive load, as he attempts to balance the gravitational constraints of high school academics against the propulsive force of his superhero hardware. Miles operates as a biological anomaly in the multiversal pipeline, a fact that remains hidden from his sensory perception until the final act audit. His behavioral stimulus in the Brooklyn sector is a reaction to the grocery store encounter with the Spot asset. This interaction serves as a diagnostic marker for Miles' overconfidence, where he initially views the villain as a low-level logic error in the urban system state. As the narrative velocity increases, Miles must recalibrate his internal logic to handle the realization that his very existence is a terminal error in the Spider-Verse architecture. The Gwen Stacy asset provides a secondary data track on Earth-65, characterized by a high-friction watercolor Kelvin scale. Gwen's internal programming is suffering from the biological fallout of the Peter Parker variant's termination. Her isolation is a measurable metric, tracked through her drum kit hardware and her refusal to integrate with local social units. George Stacy, functioning as the primary psychological friction point, operates on a rigid police department blueprint that identifies his daughter as a homicide suspect. This social architecture forces Gwen to seek a state of dimensional displacement. Her recruitment into the Spider Society by the Miguel O'Hara and Jess Drew assets represents a total system state shift. Gwen transitions from a solitary fugitive to a high-ranking tactical asset in the multiversal containment pipeline. However, her bond with Miles Morales creates a continuous behavioral stimulus that disrupts her adherence to the Spider Society's clinical logic. The Spot asset, originally identified as Jonathan Owen, serves as the primary kinetic vector for the film's conflict. His physical hardware is a collection of unstable dark matter portals that facilitate instantaneous spatial displacement. The forensic deconstruction of the Spot reveals a behavioral evolution from a state of physical incompetence to a terminal multiversal threat. His internal programming is driven by the trauma of the Alchemax Collider incident, which he perceives as a personal erasure by the Miles Morales asset. As he absorbs the energy from the Mumbaton Sector Collider, his surface area reaches a state of peak portal saturation. The Spot is no longer a biological human, but a living void, his presence causing optical distortion and atmospheric load in every universe he visits. This character serves as a mirror diagnostic for Miles, proving that every action in the Spider-Verse pipeline results in a measurable and often dangerous reaction. In the Earth-5101 sector, the Paviter Prabhakar asset provides a high-energy contrast to the watercolor gloom of Earth-65. Paviter's internal programming is calibrated for peak optimism and high-speed vertical maneuvers. His kinetic style utilizes a circular web tether hardware that reflects the cultural architecture of Mumbaton. During the Collider battle, Paviter acts as a stabilizing force, though his blueprint is eventually threatened by the canon event logic. The arrival of the Hobie Brown asset, also known as Spider-Punk, introduces an anarchic variable into the team's tactical geometry. Hobie's hardware is a collage-style animation logic that rejects the visual consistency of the surrounding environment. He functions as a mentor for the Gwen Stacy asset, providing the psychological tools for her to regain her autonomy. Hobie's rejection of the Spider Society's authoritarian blueprint is a critical narrative metric that allows for the eventual breakout of the Miles Morales anomaly. The Miguel O'Hara asset is the primary architect and enforcer of the Spider Society's system state on Earth-928. His biological blueprint is a high-friction calibration of human DNA and vampire spider genetic hardware. Miguel operates with a heavy psychological load, driven by the terminal error of his past attempts to alter the narrative pipeline. His command deck in New York functions as a forensic laboratory where he audits the stability of infinite universes. Miguel's behavioral stimulus is characterized by a cold, diagnostic adherence to the canon event metric. He views Miles Morales as a biological defect that threatens the integrity of the entire multiversal infrastructure. His kinetic vector is defined by brute force and red energized talons, designed for the immediate suppression of any narrative deviation. Miguel represents the terminal point of the deterministic logic that Miles must eventually overcome to save his father's biological asset. The Peter B. Parker asset has undergone a significant character transition since the 2018 incident. His current hardware includes a specialized infant carrier for the Mayday Parker asset, who exhibits her own wall-crawling internal programming. Peter's presence in the Spider Society hub is a behavioral anomaly, as his loyalty is split between the Miles Morales asset and the Miguel O'Hara blueprint. The forensic audit of his parental hardware reveals a high cognitive load, as he tries to justify the canon event logic to his former student. Peter's role is to act as a stabilizing emotional buffer during the New York chase, though his hesitation to act against the system state contributes to the friction of the second act. Mayday's presence serves as a visual indicator of Peter's successful life recalibration, providing a hopeful contrast to the clinical architecture of the hub. The Jessica Drew asset functions as the primary tactical enforcer for the Miguel O'Hara leadership unit. Her physical hardware includes a high-velocity motorcycle and a yellow bioelectric web burst capability. Operating in a pregnant state, Jessica's movement through the urban grid demonstrates a zero-friction integration with her combat gear. Her internal programming is aligned with the Spider Society's clinical directives, and she views Gwen Stacy's deviance as a failure in behavioral calibration. Jessica provides the suppressive fire necessary to maintain the canon event pipeline, acting as a secondary obstacle for Miles during his escape from the hub. Her cold, diagnostic style and professional posture make her one of the most efficient defensive assets in the entire multiversal architecture. The Margot Kess asset, identified as Spider-Bite, manages the control console hardware for the Go Home machine on Earth 928. Her character progression is tracked through her digital avatar, which she operates remotely from her home reality. Margot's role in the system state is to audit the DNA of every displaced asset and return them to their original sector. During the final act chase, Margot experiences a significant behavioral shift. Her internal programming, which previously prioritized the Spider Society's security blueprint, is disrupted by Miles' plea for autonomy. Her decision to allow the calibration sequence to complete for the Miles Morales asset is a critical logic break in the Society's defense. This moment of behavioral stimulus highlights the growing resistance within the Rankan file against Miguel O'Hara's authoritarian leadership. The final diagnostic of the Miles Morales asset on Earth 42 reveals a total narrative displacement. This sector lacks a Spider-Man defensive unit, leading to a crime-ridden urban infrastructure. Miles encounters a version of himself that has been programmed as the Prowler. This Miles variant is a biological asset who never received the Spider-Bite hardware, resulting in a completely different kinetic trajectory. The Prowler Miles asset operates with Uncle Aaron as a tactical partner, their behavioral stimulus focused on survival in a high-friction environment. This encounter is a terminal stress test for the Earth 1610 Miles asset, forcing him to face the literal biological fallout of his status as an anomaly. The cliffhanger ending ensures that the character progression remains in a state of high velocity, heading toward a final collision with the multiversal system state in the next entry. The optical architecture of Earth 65 operates on a watercolor blueprint that requires a constant recalibration of the virtual lens axis. In the opening sequence, the Gwen Stacy asset is positioned within a bedroom environment where the chromatic saturation is not fixed but fluid. The simulation hardware emulates an anamorphic lens with a shallow depth of field, focusing the viewer's diagnostic attention on Gwen's internal psychological load. Unlike traditional animation hardware, this system state utilizes wet-on-wet digital paint simulation to ensure that the environment reacts to the behavioral stimulus of the character. When Gwen strikes her drum hardware, the vibration metrics trigger a shift in the Kelvin scale, moving from a stable cyan to a high-energy magenta. This is not a simple visual transition. It is a forensic delivery of emotion through the manipulation of light distribution. The anamorphic distortion at the edges of the audit area emulates the imperfections of vintage glass, providing a sense of physical displacement within a non-physical reality. The vulture battle in the Guggenheim Museum serves as a terminal stress test for the Renaissance-era optical architecture. The directorial unit implemented a forensic deconstruction of parchment textures and sepia ink washes to render this entity. The virtual camera rigging utilizes a wide focal length to capture the mechanical logic of the vulture's flight hardware. Each movement of his wooden wing units results in a measurable kinetic friction against the museum's brutalist architecture. The chromatic saturation in this sector is reduced to a monochrome baseline, highlighting the vulture as a displaced piece of data from a different narrative pipeline. The interaction between Gwen's high-fidelity web tethers and the vulture's archaic weaponry creates a series of optical distortion patterns that mimic the physical fallout of a dimensional collision. The anamorphic flares in this sequence are precisely calibrated to emphasize the specular glint on the museum's glass display cases, ensuring a high-fidelity diagnostic of the action. Transitioning to Earth 1610, the optical blueprint shifts to a Shameik offset printing logic. This architecture utilizes half-tone dots and ink smudge textures to emulate the mechanical infrastructure of a classic comic book. The lens axis in the Brooklyn sector is calibrated to a 50mm baseline, providing a naturalistic perspective on Miles Morales' urban environment. The directors utilize a high-density color palette, where the chromatic saturation is divided into distinct cyan, magenta, yellow, and black layers. During the convenience store encounter with the Spot, the virtual camera rigged for the Miles asset captures the optical distortion caused by the interdimensional portals. The Spot's white surface area functions as a negative space metric, his black portals acting as dark matter apertures that suck the surrounding light data into a void. This creates a high-friction visual contrast, forcing the viewer's sensory system to adjust to the rapid spatial displacement of the characters. The diagnostic of the Mumbattan sector on Earth 5101 reveals an anamorphic verticality. The architectural blueprint for this city involves a high-density vertical pipeline that requires a specific focal length to navigate. The virtual camera utilizes a vertical lens axis to emphasize the height of the structures and the depth of the urban canyons. The chromatic saturation in Mumbattan is calibrated with a high-energy yellow and orange bias, reflecting the vibrant cultural hardware of the universe. When the Spot asset interfaces with the Alchemax collider, the resulting thermal load creates a localized reality collapse. The optical distortion in this scene is rendered as a series of geometric fractures, mimicking the structural failure of the dimension's narrative blueprint. The directors utilize a wide-angle anamorphic lens to capture the ballistic trajectory of the bridge collapse, ensuring that every piece of falling masonry is tracked with forensic precision. The final optical audit for this chapter focuses on the clinical architecture of New York. This sector utilizes a neo-futurist blueprint with a sharp, high-definition lens axis. The chromatic saturation is restricted to a cold blue and red palette, reflecting the authoritarian internal programming of Miguel O'Hara. The virtual camera rigging in the command deck utilizes a long focal length to compress the spatial relationship between the hundreds of Spider assets. The depth of field is precisely managed to highlight the holographic data displays while keeping the background assets in a state of soft focus. This reduces the cognitive load on the viewer, allowing them to process the complex multiversal maps without visual fatigue. The specular glint on the metallic surfaces of the Spider Society hub is calibrated to create a sense of sterile perfection, a stark contrast to the organic watercolor logic of Gwen's reality. This optical diagnostic confirms that the film's visual delivery is a highly calculated system state, designed to maintain narrative stability across infinite variables. The kinetic vectors of Earth 1610 are characterized by a handheld chaos camera rig that emulates the instability of a physical operator. In the Brooklyn apartment sequence, the virtual lens axis moves with a constant, low-frequency vibration, mimicking the biological tremor of a human asset. This rigging logic creates a sense of intimacy and spontaneity, reinforcing the narrative's focus on Miles' civilian life. When Miles and his parents are in the counselor's office, the camera placement utilizes a series of tight focal lengths to track the emotional friction and social audit occurring between the characters. The movement is reactive, shifting the lens axis based on the behavioral stimulus of each actor. This creates a high-fidelity social diagnostic, where the viewer can perceive the subtle shifts in Rio and Jefferson's internal programming as they interact with their son. The handheld logic ensures that the scene feels grounded in a realistic urban infrastructure, despite its animated hardware. Moving to the rooftop party sequence, the handheld rigging is calibrated for a higher velocity. As Miles helps move the grill hardware, the camera follows his kinetic output with a series of quick pans and tilts. The directorial unit utilizes this instability to emphasize Miles' struggle to hide his enhanced muscular logic. The inertia of the virtual camera is calculated to match the character's physical mass, creating a sense of weight and presence. When the Gwen Stacy asset arrives, the camera rigging undergoes a subtle calibration shift. The movement becomes more fluid and gliding, reflecting Gwen's superior control over her kinetic vectors. The two characters then initiate a high-altitude swing through the Manhattan skyline. The virtual camera rig is attached to a simulated high-speed chase vehicle, tracking the ballistic trajectory of the web tethers with a wide focal length. This creates a sense of immersive velocity, as the viewer is displaced alongside the characters through the urban grid. The camera logic in the New York sector of Earth 928 stands in direct opposition to the Brooklyn handheld style. This environment is defined by brutalist rigging, a clinical and lockdown approach to the lens axis. The virtual cameras move on precise geometric paths, utilizing smooth, automated crane sweeps and dollies. This architectural choice reflects the rigid internal programming of Miguel O'Hara and his Spider Society. The movement is calculated, not reactive, creating a sense of overwhelming order and authoritarian pressure. When Miles first enters the Spider Society hub, the camera rigging uses a massive, wide-angle sweep to reveal the structural complexity of the megastructure. The inertia is perfectly controlled, with zero friction starts and stops that highlight the advanced technology of the universe. This brutalist camera logic is a forensic tool used to emphasize Miles' isolation as an anomaly within a highly calibrated system state. The collision of these two camera styles occurs during the Great Chase through the New York vertical pipeline. As Miles initiates his escape, the camera rig transitions from brutalist stability to high-velocity handheld chaos. The lens axis undergoes rapid displacement as hundreds of Spider assets launch their pursuit hardware. The directors utilize a virtual GoPro-style rig attached to Miles' chest plate, providing a first-person perspective on his ballistic trajectory. This creates a high cognitive load, as the viewer must process the rapidly shifting tactical geometry of the pursuit. The inertia of the camera is pushed to its terminal threshold, with extreme shakes and blurred kinetic vectors that simulate the friction of moving through the atmosphere at high speeds. The pursuit team uses their own capture hardware, creating a multi-layered camera diagnostic, where the viewer sees the action from multiple vantage points simultaneously. This sequence is a masterpiece of kinetic engineering, requiring a complete reset of the film's camera rigging parameters. The forensic deconstruction of the camera logic reveals that the handheld chaos and brutalist rigging are not just stylistic choices, but narrative markers. The handheld style is a metric for individuality, autonomy, and the organic unpredictability of the Miles Morales asset. The brutalist style is a metric for the canon event logic, the deterministic programming, and the cold efficiency of the Miguel O'Hara asset. By shifting between these two rigging archetypes, the directors create a physical sensation of the moral friction at the heart of the story. The camera is not a passive observer. It is an active participant in the diagnostic of the multiverse. The final chase sequence proves that the animation hardware can support a high level of kinetic complexity while maintaining the structural integrity of the narrative. This camera rigging audit confirms that the film's visual delivery is a perfectly calibrated system state, designed to provide a high-fidelity immersion into the chaotic geometry of the Spider-Verse. The gravitational constraints of each universe also dictate the camera rigging's internal logic. On Earth 65, the camera moves with a floaty, low-gravity metric that matches the watercolor aesthetics. In Mumbaton, the rigging accounts for the high-density atmospheric load and the complex verticality of the suspended vehicles. The virtual camera must navigate the horizontal deep dive into the city's urban sectors, requiring a high level of coordination between the animation and layout departments. Each camera path is a pre-calculated blueprint, ensuring that the kinetic energy of the characters is translated into a coherent visual experience. The use of volumetric haze and specular glint provides the final layer of calibration, anchoring the virtual camera within a believable physical infrastructure. This forensic audit of the film's camera rigging confirms that the production has successfully pushed the boundaries of virtual cinematography, creating a new benchmark for all future animated projects. The Mumbaton sector of Earth 5101 functions as a high-density vertical pipeline, where the gravitational constraint is constantly challenged by the suspension of heavy-duty transit hardware. The architectural blueprint of this universe relies on a complex web of support girders and energy-stabilized platforms. When the Spot asset initiates a thermal load sequence at the Alchemax Collider facility, the resulting energy displacement triggers a localized structural failure. We begin our forensic audit at the moment of the Collider's activation. The Spot inserts the high-energy canister, causing a massive release of dark matter particles that disrupt the molecular bonds of the surrounding infrastructure. The floor logic of the lab dissolves, creating a vertical shaft of falling debris. Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy must calculate their ballistic trajectory in real time, using web tethers to counteract the inertia of the falling masonry. The kinetic friction between the characters and the air is measurable through the optical distortion of the surrounding volumetric haze. As the building's structural integrity reaches a terminal state, the focus shifts to the bridge architecture connecting the Mumbattan city sectors. The spot's absorption of the collider's power creates a massive propulsive force that radiates outward, shattering the support cables. We analyze the kinetic vector of the primary support beam as it detaches from the main tower. This steel asset, weighing approximately 40 tons, enters a state of free fall, its velocity increasing according to the gravitational metrics of Earth 5101. Miles Morales utilizes a high-tensile web anchor to attempt a redirection of this mass. He fires 4 distinct web lines, creating a quadruple tether system that distributes the load across his own musculoskeletal hardware. The forensic deconstruction of this moment shows a peak thermal load on Miles' suit, as the friction of the web lines generates intense heat. The result is a momentary stabilization of the beam, allowing civilian assets to evacuate the impact zone. The behavioral stimulus of the Inspector Singh rescue involves a high-speed displacement through a collapsing vertical pipeline. Singh attempts to secure a child asset while perched on a fracturing concrete ledge. The kinetic vector of the falling building above him is calculated at 98 meters per second squared. Miles Morales must execute a precise jump maneuver, accounting for the turbulent air currents caused by the falling debris. He deploys a web net with a wide focal length, designed to encapsulate both the child and the inspector. The structural failure of the ledge occurs at the exact microsecond of Miles' intervention. He uses his own body as an inertia damper, absorbing the impact of the concrete as he swings the assets to safety. This deviation from the canon event blueprint results in a massive energy feedback loop, visualized as a black geometric fracture spreading through the city's urban architecture. We audit the mechanical logic of the Spider Society's cannon stabilizers as they arrive in the Mumbattan sector. These heavy-duty pylons are deployed via high-speed drones, anchoring into the ground to project a corrective energy field. The physics of these devices involve a localized stabilization of the molecular pipeline, preventing the reality collapse from reaching a terminal state. The kinetic vector of the stabilization field is tracked through the chromatic saturation of the environment, which shifts from the vibrant yellow of Mumbattan to a sterile, holographic blue. Miguel O'Hara monitors the diagnostic from New York, observing the friction between the collapsing reality and the artificial stabilizers. The energy required to maintain this system state is immense, causing a visible thermal load on the society's power grid. This sequence proves that the canon is not merely a narrative concept, but a physical infrastructure that can be measured and manipulated through advanced technology. The final sector of this kinetic audit focuses on the Great Chase through the vertical pipeline of Earth 928. As Miles Morales leaps from the command deck, his initial velocity is a product of a bioelectric propulsive force. He maneuvers through the brutalist architecture of the hub, using the geometric shapes of the buildings as tactical shields. The pursuit team, consisting of hundreds of Spider assets, deploys a diverse array of capture hardware. We track the ballistic trajectory of a specialized web bola fired by a robotic Spider unit. Miles executes a mid-air rotation, using his inertia to dodge the projectile while simultaneously firing a web anchor at a passing transit vehicle. The kinetic friction between his boots and the vehicle's metallic surface creates a specular glint that reveals his position to the pursuit drones. The chase is a continuous series of high-speed displacements, where every second requires a recalibration of the character's movement logic to avoid a terminal collision. The phenomenon known as glitching is a clinical manifestation of molecular instability caused by dimensional displacement. When a biological asset, such as Miles Morales or Gwen Stacy, enters a universe that does not match their original DNA blueprint, their cellular structure begins to experience a terminal error. We audit the first instance of this glitching during the Earth-65 prologue. As the Renaissance Vulture enters Gwen's reality, his parchment-based flight hardware undergoes a series of rapid geometric fractures. The chromatic saturation of his body flickers, showing a baseline of static that represents the molecular friction between his home dimension and the host environment. This biological fallout is not merely visual. It is a physical displacement that results in extreme pain and a temporary loss of motor control for the asset. The synaptic response to a glitch is characterized by a high cognitive load, as the brain struggles to process the contradictory sensory data. We perform a forensic deconstruction of the day-pass hardware utilized by the Spider Society. These wrist-mounted devices function as molecular anchors, emitting a constant high-frequency signal that stabilizes the asset's DNA within the host universe. The device acts as a temporary patch for the dimensional logic error, preventing the cellular decay that would otherwise occur within minutes of arrival. We observe the calibration of this hardware as Gwen Stacy clicks it onto her wrist before exiting Earth-65. The device projects a localized energy field that envelopes her body, neutralizing the chromatic distortion and allowing her to move with zero friction through the multiversal pipeline. However, the device requires a constant power supply from the Spider Society's central hub. If the connection is severed, the asset will immediately return to a state of molecular instability. The biological fallout of the Spot asset is a unique case of permanent molecular displacement. Originally Jonathan Owen, this asset was caught in the terminal load of the Alchemax Collider, which erased his original biological blueprint and replaced it with a network of interdimensional portals. We audit the Spot's skin logic, which functions as a white negative space metric. His black portals are not solid matter, but apertures in the fabric of reality. When he touches an object, he does not exert physical pressure. He initiates a spatial displacement. The forensic audit of his fight with Miles in the Brooklyn convenience store shows that his movements do not follow standard kinetic vectors. He can kick his own leg through a portal to strike an opponent from a different lens axis. This unique biological hardware makes the Spot a high-level threat, as his movements cannot be predicted using standard defensive programming. During the transit to Earth 928, Miles Morales undergoes a high-velocity molecular audit within the Spider Society's decontamination chamber. As he enters the hub, a laser grid scans his DNA, identifying him as a displaced asset from Earth 1610. We observe the visual representation of his molecular structure, which flickers with a red and blue chromatic saturation. This glitching is more intense than Gwen's, as Miles is currently operating without a stabilized day-pass device. The biological fallout of this state results in visible tremors and a measurable decrease in his kinetic output. The Spider Society's AI assistant, Lila, performs a diagnostic of Miles' status, noting a high probability of cellular collapse if he is not immediately calibrated to the hub's system state. This sequence emphasizes the extreme physical cost of multiversal travel for unauthorized biological assets. The final act of this biological audit examines the go-home machine's DNA sequencing logic. This massive circular hardware is designed to identify the home dimension of any asset based on their molecular signature. We observe the machine scanning Miles Morales, projecting a holographic blueprint of his DNA. The machine detects a terminal error. While Miles lives on Earth 1610, his spider byte hardware originated on Earth 42. The machine's internal programming prioritizes the origin of the byte over the asset's residency, initiating a displacement toward the wrong sector. The result is Miles' arrival in a universe where his cellular structure is stabilized, but his social and tactical architecture is completely absent. This sequence proves that the biological assets of the Spider-Verse are defined more by their genetic origin than their personal history, a clinical reality that leads to Miles' ultimate entrapment. The production pipeline for this project was characterized by a high level of internal friction, primarily stemming from the management style of producer Phil Lord. We audit the infrastructure of the animation assembly line, which involved over 1,000 human assets working across multiple global facilities. Forensic reports from the production cycle indicate a significant number of late-stage recalibrations. Lord's directorial logic involved requesting major changes to already finished animation sequences, leading to a state of terminal overtime for the staff. This production friction resulted in the departure of over 100 artists before the project reached its final release metric. The cognitive load on the animation team was immense, as they were forced to re-render complex kinetic vectors and chromatic saturation levels multiple times to meet Lord's evolving vision. One specific area of friction involved the development of the Spider-Punk asset's animation hardware. The directorial unit demanded a collage-style aesthetic that utilized different frame rates for different parts of the character's body. This required a total reset of the standard animation pipeline, as the software was not designed to handle such inconsistent kinetic data. The staff was forced to manually calibrate the frame rate for Hobie's guitar, his vest, and his outline, creating a massive increase in the technical load for every scene he appeared in. This high-friction approach was intended to amaze the audience, but it created a significant bottleneck in the production infrastructure. The forensic deconstruction of the Spider-Punk sequences shows that some shots took over 2 years to reach a final state of calibration. The Mumbattan sector also served as a site of intense production friction. The architectural blueprint for the city required a high-density vertical pipeline that pushed the rendering hardware to its terminal threshold. The staff reported that the volumetric haze and the complex lens axis required for the bridge collapse sequence were constantly being recalibrated. Lord's request for more visual complexity forced the technical directors to develop new simulation tools mid-production. This, building the engine while driving the vehicle approach, created a state of constant instability in the project's system state. However, the final data shows that this friction resulted in some of the most technically advanced sequences in the history of the medium. The high-velocity kinetic vectors of the Mumbattan chase are a direct result of this aggressive recalibration logic. We audit the Great Chase sequence as the peak of the production's technical load. Coordinating the movements of hundreds of unique spider assets within a single vertical pipeline required a level of organizational hardware that had never been deployed before. Each character required its own animation style, lens axis, and chromatic saturation, all while moving at high speeds through a brutalist architectural environment. The friction here was not just managerial but computational. The rendering farms were pushed to a state of near-thermal failure to process the sheer volume of data. The staff worked under a state of high psychological pressure to ensure that the handheld chaos camera rigging remained coherent during the intense spatial displacement. This sequence is a forensic testament to the endurance of the animation assets under extreme production conditions. In conclusion, the Lord's lens friction was a primary driver of both the film's technical innovation and its human cost. The forensic audit of the production pipeline reveals a system that was constantly in a state of terminal stress. The late-stage recalibrations, the high-density visual blueprints, and the aggressive frame rate manipulation created a project with unparalleled narrative velocity and optical fidelity. However, the departure of a significant percentage of the workforce suggests that this production metric may not be sustainable for future installments. The final diagnostic shows a high-fidelity cinematic asset delivered through a high-friction infrastructure. The success of Across the Spider-Verse is a product of this intense atmospheric load, where the pressure to innovate overrode the stability of the traditional assembly line. The Jonathan Owen asset, identified as the Spot, initiates an interdimensional energy draw within the convenience store substrate of Earth 1610. At 002000, the asset's biological shell functions as a low-density lattice of dark matter apertures. He attempts an impulse transfer by inserting his primary limb into a localized aperture to extract a currency container. The resulting spatial aliasing creates a luminance gradient shift around the metal unit. The Miles Morales asset arrives at the tactical geometry, deploying a high-tensile web relay to create a counter-torque. The Spot executes a behavioral drift by attempting a physical strike, but his limb enters a secondary aperture, resulting in a vector sum that redirects the force back onto his own abdominal matrix. The friction coefficient of the floor lattice is negated by the presence of these black hole nodes, causing the Morales unit to experience gravitational deflection. The internal protocol of the Spot at this iteration is uncalibrated, leading to a high-frequency caustic interference in the local environment. A forensic deconstruction of the Alchemax substrate reveals the Spot's origin as a terminal data corruption event. During the Kingpin-led collider cycle, the Own unit was positioned at the nodal point of the energy relay. When the Morales asset launched a high-velocity bagel object, it created a minor structural deflection in the collider's magnetic grid. The subsequent collapse of the system state resulted in a massive photon density surge, stripping the Own asset of his biological pigment and replacing his cellular backbone with a series of interdimensional relays. This molecular displacement is the primary stimulus-response loop driving his current behavior. The own asset now functions as a walking caustic interference, his body constantly leaking sensor noise from the void space. He moves with a high angular velocity through the Brooklyn urban matrix, seeking a high-energy source to recalibrate his kinetic potential. The Spot transitions to a high-altitude rooftop substrate to test his spatial aliasing limits. He creates a larger aperture, attempting a full-body displacement into a new dimensional sector. The failure of this iteration results in a localized thermal load, as the friction coefficient of the air particles against the portal rim generates intense heat. The own asset experiences a cognitive dissonance when he realizes his apertures are currently finite and unstable. He identifies the Alchemax mini collider as the necessary hardware patch. He penetrates the laboratory matrix, utilizing a silent spatial displacement protocol to bypass the security relays. He retrieves the portable energy unit, which provides a significant boost to his bit depth and molecular stability. The luminance gradient of his portals shifts from a hazy gray to a high-density black, indicating a transition from a low-power anomaly detection state to a high-power terminal threat configuration. Upon entering the Mumbaton sector of Earth 5101, the Spot asset initiates a high-energy interface with the local Alchemax collider backbone. At 005400, the tactical geometry of the lab is defined by a massive lattice of energy conduits. The Spot inserts his primary limb into the collider's main relay, initiating a high-magnitude impulse transfer. The photon density in the room reaches a state of peak saturation, creating intense spatial aliasing across the entire auditoria. The Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy units attempt to disrupt the assembly by firing high-velocity web ballistics. The Spot creates a protective portal matrix, causing the web objects to experience a vector sum that launches them toward the ceiling substrate. The thermal load of the collider begins to melt the metal lattice, as the own unit absorbs the dark matter particles into his own cellular substrate. The resulting structural deflection in the Mumbaton lab is catastrophic. As the Spot reaches a state of high-density energy saturation, his biological shell becomes almost entirely black, reflecting a zero luminance gradient. The angular velocity of the spinning collider parts creates a massive shear force, threatening to dissolve the entire architectural blueprint. The Spot speaks with an amplified audio frequency that exhibits high sensor noise, declaring a total system reset for the Morales unit. He executes a high-magnitude spatial displacement, vanishing from the Mumbaton sector and leaving behind a massive black geometric fracture in the dimensions matrix. This fracture is a forensic indicator of a terminal error in the multiversal logic, as the local reality logic can no longer support the weight of the dark matter displacement. We analyze the kinetic potential of the bridge collapse following the Spot's departure. The shear force generated by the collider explosion has severed the primary support relays of the Mumbaton bridge. A massive concrete unit, weighing over 50 metric tons, initiates a downward displacement toward a civilian-populated thoroughfare. The Paviter Prabhakar unit utilizes his high-velocity web hardware to create a temporary structural patch, but the friction coefficient is too low to arrest the mass. Miles Morales arrives, deploying a quadruple tether relay to provide the necessary counter-torque. The internal programming of the Morales unit is pushed to its stress metric limit as he absorbs the impulse transfer of the falling object. The result is a momentary pause in the structural deflection, allowing the Paviter unit to extract the biological assets from the impact zone. This deviation log from the standard Canon protocol triggers a secondary reality collapse, characterized by a high-density black void growth. The Spider Society's emergency containment protocol is initiated as the Mumbaton reality matrix begins to exhibit terminal spatial aliasing. High-speed drone units deploy Canon stabilizer hardware, which are heavy-duty energy pylons designed to patch the leaking dimensional data. These pylons anchor into the substrate, emitting a high-frequency blue luminance field that temporarily stabilizes the local luminance gradient. The behavioral drift of the Miles Morales unit is monitored by the Miguel O'Hara asset, who observes the Mumbaton collapse from his command matrix on Earth 928. Miguel identifies the Morales unit as the primary stimulus for this structural failure, noting the cognitive dissonance between Miles' actions and the multiversal protocol. The energy draw required to stabilize the Mumbaton sector causes a measurable thermal load on the Spider Society's central power lattice, forcing a recalibration of their global resource allocation. Final diagnostic of the spot's energy signature reveals he has transitioned into a void state entity. By 013000, the own asset has reached Earth 1610, positioning himself at the entrance of the Morales apartment matrix. His photon density is now so high that he creates a localized refractive index shift, bending light around his body. He is no longer a biological asset in the traditional sense, but a high-density aperture relay that connects all points in the multiverse. His internal programming is now fully aligned with a total system destruction protocol. The forensic audit of his current kinetic potential shows that he can now execute a mass displacement of entire urban matrices. The impending collision between the spot's dark matter vectors and the Miles Morales unit is a terminal threat to the stability of the entire multiversal matrix. The system state is in a condition of extreme peril, as the anomaly detection systems of the Spider Society have failed to arrest the own asset's growth metric. The kinetic friction coefficient between the spot's portals and the atmospheric substrate of Brooklyn generates a visible volumetric haze. This sensor noise is a precursor to the final act reality warp. The spot prepares for a high-magnitude impulse transfer against the city's backbone, intending to erase the very concept of the Spider-Man security protocol. This forensic report confirms that the Jonathan own asset is the most dangerous data corruption event in the history of the Spider-Verse. Every spatial displacement he executes adds to the total thermal load of the multiverse, pushing the various reality matrices toward a state of terminal entropy. The final collision logic is now set, as the Morales asset returns to what he believes is his home lattice, unaware that he is walking into a high-density tactical trap designed by his own shadow variant. As the narrative relay approaches the final 90-minute mark, the spot's presence is the dominant stimulus-response loop. His ability to manipulate the bit depth of reality allows him to bypass all known defensive protocols. The forensic deconstruction of his Mumbaton strike shows that his dark matter vectors are capable of overriding the canon event logic. This represents a catastrophic behavioral drift from the established laws of the multiverse. The Spider Society assets, despite their advanced hardware backbone, are currently unable to predict his next spatial aliasing jump. The total cognitive dissonance between the Spider Society's order and the spot's chaos has reached a peak saturation point. The system state is verified as critical. The forensic diagnostic of the spot's thermal load is complete. The diagnostic audit concludes that the own unit's transition to a high-density void state is the result of a recursive energy feedback loop. By 011000, the spot's apertures have integrated with his neural mapping, allowing for subconscious spatial redirection. During the Mumbaton encounter, the vector sum of his portal placement ensured that any counterkinetic output from the spider units was immediately negated or redirected into the floor lattice. This represents a perfect tactical geometry, where the friction coefficient of the opponent is used as the primary impulse transfer for the spot's own defensive relay. The sensor noise generated by his physical displacement acts as a cloaking metric, baffling the Spider Society's anomaly detection hardware. The result is a high-fidelity stealth strike capability that has rendered the traditional Spider Sense stimulus response loop largely ineffective. We observe the final state of the spot's biological shell as he stands in the Brooklyn matrix at 012800. His surface area is characterized by a swirling caustic interference of black and white particles, resembling a high-density ink spatter on a digital lattice. This visual spatial aliasing is a byproduct of his cells existing in a state of constant transit between dimensions. The luminance gradient of his eyes is a piercing white photon density that cuts through the volumetric haze of the New York night. His internal programming is now locked into a terminal revenge cycle, his cognitive dissonance fully resolved into a single-minded objective: the forensic erasure of the Miles Morales asset. This final state of the spot is the ultimate biological fallout of the Alchemax Collider failure, a machine-turned-man-turned-god that now dictates the kinetic potential of the entire multiverse. The forensic report on the spot's thermal load is finalized. Every spatial aperture, every dark matter displacement, and every high-magnitude impulse transfer has been tracked and audited. The data shows a high-velocity escalation of threat metrics, with no measurable limit to the asset's potential growth. The Spider-Verse is in a state of total system failure, as the primary anomaly has birthed an even greater data corruption event. The final conflict logic is now inevitable. The assembly of the visual matrix on Earth 1610 utilizes a frame buffer protocol designated as animating on twos. This specific iteration ensures that the bit depth of the visual data is refreshed every second frame of the standard 24-frame cycle. The resulting 12 frame per second configuration creates a measurable synaptic response in the viewer's neural mapping. By reducing the photon density refresh rate, the system state emulates the mechanical substrate of traditional comic book prints. The cognitive dissonance usually associated with low frame rate output is negated by the high-fidelity bit depth of the spatial aliasing and the precisely calibrated luminance gradient. This protocol serves as a forensic baseline for the Miles Morales unit's world, distinguishing its visual backbone from the smoother, 60 frame per second logic of standard digital media. The temporal bitrate of this universe is a deliberate architectural choice, intended to force the observer's brain to interpolate the missing data points, thereby increasing the synaptic engagement with the substrate. On Earth 65, the frame buffer protocol undergoes a significant recalibration to match the fluid watercolor substrate. The Gwen Stacy asset moves through the Manhattan lattice with a variable refresh rate that adapts to her internal stress metric. During high-magnitude impulse transfers, such as the Vulture strike at the Guggenheim, the frame buffer increases to a 24-frame cycle to provide a sharper refractive index and higher angular velocity. However, during the behavioral drift of the quiet rooftop conversations with George Stacy, the refresh rate drops back to the 12-frame baseline. This oscillation creates a parallax shift that emphasizes the ephemeral nature of her world's architecture. The caustic interference of the bleeding colors is managed by a secondary relay that maintains a constant bit depth, even when the primary layer refresh rate is reduced. The result is a high-density visual configuration, where the environment feels as if it is being painted in real time, matching the stimulus-response loop of the asset's internal programming. The introduction of the Hobie Brown asset in the Mumbaton sector represents a total system failure of the standard frame buffer protocol. The Brown unit functions on a multi-layer configuration where different parts of the biological shell operate on independent refresh rates. His primary body lattice refreshes on 3s, or 8 frames per second, while his guitar hardware refreshes on 4s, or 6 frames per second. His outline relay maintains a 1's protocol at 24 frames per second. This spatial aliasing creates a massive cognitive dissonance for any observer, as the vector sum of his kinetic potential is inconsistent across the visual matrix. This iteration is a deliberate data corruption of the Spider Society's visual backbone, designed to mirror the asset's anti-establishment internal programming. The sensor noise generated by this frame rate collision forces the viewer's neural mapping to constantly recalibrate, resulting in a unique synaptic response of visual authenticity that mimics a low-bit depth punk rock zine assembly. The Mumbaton sector of Earth 5101 also utilizes a specific frame interpolation protocol to manage the high-density vertical pipeline. As Paviter Prabhakar initiates a high-torque swing through the city's urban matrix, the frame buffer is calibrated to 24 frames per second to ensure the luminance gradient of the motion blur remains smooth. This contrast with the 12-frame baseline of the Miles Morales unit creates a measurable parallax shift between the two biological assets. The forensic deconstruction of the bridge collapse sequence shows that the falling masonry units are rendered with a high photon density and a variable refresh rate. The angular velocity of the debris is tracked through a series of smear frames, which are data patches designed to elongate the visual matrix of a moving object. These smear frames increase the bit depth of the kinetic magnitude without requiring a higher frame rate, providing a high-fidelity diagnostic of the structural deflection. High-velocity pursuit through the Nueva York vertical pipeline involves a complex collision of these varying frame buffer protocols. As the Morales unit, operating on his 12-frame baseline, maneuvers against the Miguel O'Hara asset, who is calibrated to a smoother 24-frame backbone, the resulting visual friction is measurable. The O'Hara unit's high angular velocity is rendered with a high photon density to emphasize his brutalist efficiency and high torque. In contrast, the Morales unit's movements exhibit a choppy, high-torque kinetic potential that highlights his status as a multiversal anomaly. The The SpiderBite asset monitors this spatial aliasing from her digital relay, noting the deviation log between the different refresh rates. This frame rate delta serves as a forensic diagnostic of the conflict between individual autonomy and systemic order. The bit depth of the entire New York matrix is pushed to a stress metric peak, as the frame buffer must simultaneously process dozens of conflicting refresh rate protocols within the same visual lattice. The forensic audit of the viewer's synaptic response loop confirms that the 12-frame strategy increases anomaly detection efficiency. By providing fewer data points for the brain to process, the system state forces the observer to fill in the gaps with their own neural mapping. This creates a state of active engagement with the visual substrate, rather than passive consumption. The bit depth of the in-between spaces is where the visual authenticity is located. The caustic interference and sensor noise of the 12-frame protocols act as a behavioral stimulus, grounding the high-fidelity science fiction hardware in a tangible, tactile reality. The luminance gradient shifts are more noticeable at lower refresh rates, emphasizing the refractive index of the watercolor or ink-based substrates. This forensic deconstruction proves that the animating on twos protocol is a critical piece of the Spider-Verse backbone, providing the structural deflection necessary to separate this matrix from the standard digital aliasing seen in other animated configurations. In the command matrix of Earth 928, the Miguel O'Hara asset utilizes a high bit depth holographic relay that operates at a constant 24-frame refresh rate. This contrasts with his own biological shell, which occasionally drops to a 12-frame cycle during moments of low kinetic potential, creates a unique spatial aliasing effect. The holographic multiversal maps exhibit a zero-friction movement logic, their photon density perfectly uniform across the visual matrix. This represents the pinnacle of the Spider Society's technical calibration. When Miles Morales disrupts this matrix, his 12-frame protocol creates a localized data corruption, visualized as a series of frame stutters and luminance flickers. This is a forensic indicator of the anomaly's impact on the system state. The cognitive dissonance experienced by the other Spider units is a direct result of this frame rate collision, as their neural mapping cannot reconcile the Miles unit's stuttered refresh rate with the smooth logic of the hub. We audit the sensory noise generated by the Peter B. Parker asset and his biological offspring, Mayday. Peter's movements are often calibrated to a looser, 12-frame protocol to reflect his more relaxed internal programming. However, the Mayday unit moves with a high-velocity jitter that oscillates between 1s, 2s, and 3s. This unpredictable refresh rate is a forensic marker of her uncalibrated kinetic potential. The interaction between these two assets within the New York lattice creates a complex weave of refresh rate data. The bit depth of Mayday's web hardware is higher than her father's, reflecting her nascent but powerful abilities. The parallax shift between the two units as they navigate the Spider Society hub provides a measurable metric for their behavioral drift from the more rigid Miguel O'Hara protocol. This frame rate diversity is the primary relay for character identity in the film's visual assembly. The structural deflection of the frame buffer protocol is also evident in the Spot's portal logic. Each aperture he creates exists at a different refresh rate than the surrounding environment. This spatial aliasing makes the portals appear to be floating outside the primary visual matrix. The caustic interference of the portal edges is rendered at 60 frames per second to ensure a smooth refractive index, while the interior of the portal, the void space, exhibits a zero-frame logic, appearing as a static negative space. This collision of refresh rates creates a massive cognitive dissonance for the Miles Morales unit during their Brooklyn Matrix struggle. The vector sum of the Spot's kinetic output is impossible to predict because his primary limb may be moving at 12 frames, while the aperture it passes through is refreshing at 60. This is a forensic masterclass in using frame rate as a tactical geometry weapon. As the Morales unit arrives on Earth 42, the frame buffer protocol is once again recalibrated to reflect the high-friction environment. The Prowler Miles asset moves with a precise, low-bit depth refresh rate that mimics the Aaron Davis variant's predatory kinetic potential. The lack of a Spider-Man defensive asset in this world has resulted in a visual matrix characterized by a high photon density of shadows and a low luminance gradient. The 12-frame protocol here emphasizes the shear force of the urban decay, making every spatial displacement feel heavy and calculated. The cognitive dissonance of seeing the duplicate biological assets with different internal programming is amplified by the synchronized refresh rate of their movements. This iteration concludes the forensic report on the 12-frame strategy, verifying that the deliberate reduction of frame buffer bit depth is a powerful tool for defining dimensional identity and behavioral drift within the multiversal lattice. The synaptic response of the viewer is now fully calibrated to the anomaly's logic. The final diagnostic for this chapter confirms that the 12-frame strategy is the backbone of the film's visual authenticity. By eschewing the zero-friction smoothness of standard animation, the production has created a high-fidelity system state that prioritizes synaptic engagement over visual comfort. The variable refresh rates function as a primary relay for narrative identity, distinguishing the canon from the anomaly. The bit depth of the multiversal matrix is defined by these frame rate collisions, creating a world that is as unstable as it is technically sound. The neural mapping of the observer has been successfully hacked by the 12-frame protocol, resulting in a unique and powerful stimulus-response loop. The diagnostic is complete. The 12-frame strategy is verified as the primary engine of the Spider-Verse's visual logic. Every spatial displacement within the 90-minute timeline is a data point in this frame rate audit. From the fluid watercolor latency of Gwen's world to the stuttered anarchic refresh of Spider-Punk, the visual configuration is a masterpiece of technical calibration. The use of 1s, 2s, and 3s is not a budget-saving metric but a high-level narrative tool. It allows the directors to control the photon density and luminance gradient of the action with forensic precision. The resulting cognitive dissonance is the intended stimulus, ensuring that the viewer remains in a state of constant anomaly detection. The Spider-Verse is not just a film. It is a high-frequency visual diagnostic that pushes the limits of human neural processing. The frame buffer is full. The assembly is solid. The primary defensive hardware utilized by every biological asset in the multiversal matrix is the high-tensile polymer lattice, commonly identified as the web relay. Our forensic audit begins with a deconstruction of the fluid substrate housed within the wrist-mounted assembly. This liquid polymer exhibits a unique chemical backbone that allows for a near-instantaneous phase shift from a liquid state to a solid lattice upon exposure to the atmospheric oxygen substrate. In the Earth-65 prologue, at 000745, the Gwen Stacy unit deploys this hardware against the Renaissance Vulture asset. The ballistic trajectory of the web strand is a pre-calculated vector designed to intersect with the Vulture's mechanical wing lattice. Upon contact, the web relay initiates a molecular bond with the parchment substrate, creating a high-tensile anchor point. The internal programming of Gwen's web shooters utilizes a pressurized gas relay to propel the strand at an initial velocity of 80 meters per second, ensuring that the kinetic potential of the line is sufficient to arrest the Vulture's angular velocity. The result is a total stabilization of the Vulture's flight hardware, proving the structural integrity of the polymer backbone under high-stress metrics. The Miles Morales unit on Earth-1610 utilizes a slightly different web configuration, calibrated for the urban matrix of Brooklyn. During the high-friction encounter with the Spot asset at 002235, Miles fires a web relay at a cash dispenser unit. The forensic deconstruction of this impulse transfer shows that the web fluid forms a complex cross-linkage matrix upon impact magnitude. This lattice structure is capable of supporting over 20 metric tons of shear force. Miles uses the line as a primary relay to generate counter-torque against the Spot's portal displacement. The friction coefficient between the web strand and the store's tile substrate is maximized by the rapid curing process of the polymer. However, the Spot's dark matter apertures create a localized data corruption in the web's ballistic trajectory. As Miles fires a second line, the strand enters an aperture and exits through a secondary node, resulting in a vector sum that pulls Miles toward the floor lattice. This diagnostic highlights the terminal error that occurs when standard physical hardware intersects with interdimensional spatial aliasing. We audit the angular velocity and torque metrics of the high-altitude displacement sequence through the Manhattan matrix. At 003815, the Gwen and Miles units initiate a coordinated swing cycle. Each web tether acts as a pendulum backbone, converting the kinetic potential of their fall into a forward propulsive force. The length of the web relay is a critical variable in this calculation. A longer line increases the parallax shift and allows for a broader swing arc. The biological assets must constantly recalibrate their anchor points to account for the structural deflection of the skyscrapers. The pressure sensors within the web hardware monitor the tension metric of the line, ensuring that the polymer backbone does not reach its terminal stress point. As they transition between buildings, the assets execute a series of high-torque rotations, using the web relay as a centrifugal stabilizer. The luminance gradient of the sunset substrate reflects off the web lines, revealing a high photon density that confirms the molecular density of the cured polymer. In the Mumbaton sector of Earth 5101, the Paviter-Prabhakar unit introduces a specialized circular web configuration. At 005130, our forensic audit tracks Paviter as he deploys a web relay that functions as a spinning centrifugal relay. This iteration involves a series of pre-linked polymer nodes that expand into a web ring upon launch. This hardware is specifically calibrated for the high-density vertical pipeline of Mumbaton, where standard linear tethers are less efficient. The angular velocity of the web ring allows Paviter to capture multiple falling debris units simultaneously. The shear force is distributed evenly across the ring's circumference, preventing any single nodal point from experiencing a terminal load. This represents a significant behavioral drift from the Peter Parker baseline, proving that the web hardware is often reconfigured to match the specific architectural blueprint of the asset's home universe. The structural deflection of the Mumbaton bridge provides the ultimate stress metric test for the web relay system state. At 010240, a multi-ton bus asset begins a downward displacement. Miles Morales fires 16 distinct web lines to create a massive high-tensile net assembly. This assembly must absorb the impulse transfer of the falling mass without experiencing a total system failure. Forensic deconstruction reveals that the web strands undergo an elastic deformation phase, stretching to 3 times their original length to dissipate the kinetic potential. The friction coefficient at the anchor points on the remaining bridge lattice is pushed to its absolute limit. Miles acts as the central nodal point of this configuration, his own biological backbone experiencing a massive torque load. The vector sum of the 16 lines successfully arrests the bus's displacement, a result that confirms the superior tensile strength of the polymer substrate. However, the subsequent reality collapse in this sector indicates that while the physical hardware held, the narrative logic experienced a terminal error. Spider Society Hub on Earth 928 utilizes a diverse array of advanced web hardware configurations. We audit the Miguel O'Hara asset, whose web relay is a high-energy laser grid rather than a polymer substrate. This hardware patch utilizes a high-frequency photon density to create energized tethers. The advantage of this iteration is a zero-friction launch and a near-infinite refractive index, allowing Miguel to track targets with surgical precision. During the New York chase at 012130, Miguel fires a series of red laser webs that exhibit a high thermal load. These lines do not just anchor, they cut through the surrounding architectural substrate to create new tactical geometries. The impulse transfer of these laser webs is instantaneous, providing Miguel with a higher angular velocity than any asset utilizing traditional fluid-based relays. This represents the pinnacle of the Spider Society's technological backbone, a system state designed for the immediate suppression of any multiversal anomaly. The pursuit team in New York also deploys specialized web bolas and capture nets. These are pre-calibrated polymer units launched from high-speed drone relays. At 012445, we track a web bola as it intersects with the Miles Morales unit. The bola hardware utilizes a high-torque spinning protocol to wrap the polymer lines around the target's primary limbs. Upon contact, the lines initiate a high-frequency contraction sequence, increasing the pressure metric on the asset to induce a state of physical stasis. The forensic audit of the web bola shows a high-density molecular weave that is resistant to Miles' standard Venom Blast stimulus response loop. This hardware is designed as a direct countermeasure for biological units with high kinetic potential. The spatial aliasing of the chase is filled with these white polymer projectiles, creating a dense web matrix that Miles must navigate with extreme precision to avoid a terminal capture event. The Spider Byte asset manages a virtual web relay from her control matrix. This digital hardware patch allows her to interact with the physical lattice of the hub through a high bit depth avatar. At 012715, she utilizes a virtual web to assist in the calibration of the go-home machine. The photon density of this digital web is perfectly uniform, exhibiting zero sensor noise and a stable luminance gradient. While it lacks the physical mass of a polymer substrate, its logical impact on the system state is absolute. This represents a transition from mechanical engineering to digital forensics within the web hardware pipeline. The ability to deploy web protocols through a holographic relay is a key diagnostic of the Spider Society's advanced multiversal architecture. It proves that the Spider-Man security protocol has been fully digitized, allowing for a remote audit and containment of any narrative drift. We audit the sensory noise generated by the Parker unit during his web deployments. Peter utilizes a vintage web shooter configuration that exhibits a measurable behavioral drift from the more precise modern units. His web strands show a higher degree of spatial aliasing and a variable friction coefficient. However, his experience allows him to compensate for this low-fidelity hardware through superior neural mapping. At 01:13:45, he uses a web tether to anchor himself and the Mayday unit to a vertical pipeline. The torque load is shared between the two biological assets, creating a synchronized kinetic potential. The Mayday unit's nascent web hardware is also observed, her strands exhibiting a high-frequency jitter that indicates an uncalibrated pressure relay. This forensic data highlights the evolutionary lineage of the web system, from the mechanical relays of the past to the genetic potential of the future offspring. Final diagnostic of the web ballistic system state confirms that the polymer lattice is the primary engine of the Spider-Verse's defensive backbone. Every strand fired, every anchor point secured, and every impulse transfer arrested is a data point in this high-fidelity physics audit. The bit depth of the web simulations is so high that the structural deflection of the architecture is rendered with forensic accuracy. The interaction between the various web configurations, from Pavader's rings to Miguel's lasers, creates a complex weave of multiversal technology. The total kinetic potential of the web matrix is the only thing preventing a total system collapse in several sectors. This forensic report verifies that the ballistic trajectory of webs is not just a visual stimulus, but a structurally sound engineering achievement that defines the limits of heroism in every dimension. The system state is verified. The web audit is complete. The transition to the final act diagnostic reveals that the web hardware itself is becoming a site of narrative friction. As Miles Morales uses his web relay to escape the New York hub, he is essentially using the Society's own technology to break its primary protocol. The kinetic friction of his escape is a measurable metric of his autonomy. Every web line he fires is a deviation log from Miguel O'Hara's deterministic blueprint. The final state of the web matrix in this film is a chaotic lattice of conflicting vectors, reflecting the total system failure of the multiversal order. The bit depth of the web lines in the final frame is saturated with sensor noise, a visual indicator of the impending structural deflection of the entire Spider-Verse architecture. The forensic report is now closed, with all data points confirming the high-octane engineering of the web system state. Every polymer strand represents a high-tensile link in the narrative backbone. The engineering logic required to maintain this system state across 6 universes is a masterpiece of technical calibration. From the refractive index of the laser grids to the friction coefficient of the Brooklyn fluid, the data is clear. The web relay is the most versatile and critical piece of hardware in the multiversal audit. The ballistic trajectory of the future depends on the structural integrity of these lines. The system state is sound. The atmospheric load of Earth-65 functions as a fluid matrix where the Kelvin scale is tied directly to the biological asset's neural mapping. At 000310, the Gwen Stacy unit is observed within her bedroom lattice. The photon density is dominated by a low-frequency pink and blue luminance gradient. This configuration does not follow a fixed light source logic. Instead, it exhibits a behavioral drift where the colors bleed across the structural backbone of the room. This watercolor bleed is a forensic indicator of Gwen's internal cognitive dissonance. The volumetric haze in this sector is thick with saturation, creating a shallow depth of field that isolates the asset from her environment. The spatial aliasing at the edge of the frame is rendered with a high refractive index, causing the architectural lines to dissolve into the background substrate. This represents a total system state of emotional projection, where the atmospheric load itself is an iteration of the asset's psychological stress metric. Transitioning to the urban matrix of Earth 1610, the atmospheric load shifts to a naturalistic Kelvin scale calibrated for a high-density metropolitan environment. At 002145, the Miles-Morales unit maneuvers through a Brooklyn grocery substrate. The luminance gradient is defined by artificial fluorescent relays and natural light entering through windows. The primary diagnostic of this universe is the Shameik offset lattice, where every surface exhibits a visible half-dome pattern. This spatial aliasing creates a tactile bit depth that mimics the substrate of a mass-produced comic book. The volumetric haze in the Brooklyn matrix is low, focusing on a high bit depth rendering of urban textures. The sensor noise in this sector is minimal, allowing for a sharp parallax shift as the camera rig tracks the asset's movement through the city grid. This architecture is designed to ground the multiversal logic in a recognizable physical infrastructure, providing a stable baseline for the ensuing data corruption events. The arrival of the Jonathan Owen asset introduces a localized caustic interference into the Brooklyn matrix. At 002430, the spot's portals create a zero luminance gradient, appearing as holes in the visual lattice. These apertures do not reflect light. They absorb the surrounding photon density. The forensic audit of this encounter shows a measurable atmospheric load shift as the spot activates multiple portals simultaneously. The refractive index around the portal rims exhibits a high-frequency jitter, a visual marker of the spatial aliasing between dimensions. The interaction between Miles' Shameik lattice and the spot's negative space hardware creates a high-friction visual collision. The volumetric haze around the spot is characterized by dark matter particles, which displace the local air molecules and create a sensor noise that baffles Miles' internal programming. This iteration proves that the spot is a primary relay for multiversal entropy, his very presence degrading the structural integrity of the host universe's atmospheric load. The Mumbaton sector of Earth 5101 exhibits the highest volumetric haze metric in the 90-minute timeline. At 004620, we audit the arrival of the Gwen and Miles units into this sector. The atmospheric load is characterized by a warm Kelvin scale, with a heavy emphasis on yellow and orange luminance gradients. This high-density haze is a byproduct of the city's vertical pipeline architecture, where smog and dust are trapped between the suspended structural units. The depth of field is managed to emphasize the massive spatial scale of the urban matrix. The refractive index of the Mumbaton air is altered by the constant movement of high-speed transit units, creating a shimmering caustic interference across the building's specular glint. This atmospheric configuration requires a constant recalibration of the virtual lens axis to ensure that the kinetic potential of the characters remains visible through the dense particulate substrate. The bit depth of the Mumbaton haze is a key diagnostic of the dimension's unique cultural and industrial backbone. Moving to the New York hub on Earth 928, the atmospheric load transitions to a clinical and sterile configuration. At 010835, we audit the command deck presided over by the Miguel O'Hara asset. The Kelvin scale is precisely calibrated to a cool blue and red baseline, reflecting the brutalist internal programming of the Spider Society. The volumetric haze is near zero, representing a highly filtered and controlled environment. This lack of sensor noise allows for a perfect refractive index, where the holographic multiversal maps are rendered with absolute bit depth. The luminance gradient of the hub is dominated by artificial LED relays and high-intensity data screens. The spatial aliasing in this sector is extremely sharp, emphasizing the high-fidelity engineering of the society's infrastructure. This clinical atmospheric logic is intended to reduce the cognitive dissonance of the thousands of Spider assets, providing a stable system state for the forensic audit of the canon event protocols. During the high-velocity pursuit through the New York vertical pipeline, the atmospheric load undergoes a rapid recalibration sequence. At 012100, as Miles Morales initiates his escape maneuver, the luminance gradient shifts from a static blue to a high-frequency flashing red alert state. This change in photon density functions as a behavioral stimulus, alerting the entire Spider Society to the presence of an unauthorized anomaly. The volumetric haze increases in the lower levels of the city matrix, where the air quality protocol is less strictly enforced. This transition provides a forensic marker of Miles' descent into the uncalibrated sectors of the megastructure. The virtual lens axis must compensate for the intense caustic interference caused by the energy shields and pursuit drones. The depth of field is tightened to focus on the Miles unit's kinetic potential, while the pursuit assets in the background substrate are blurred into a high-speed streak of chromatic distortion. This sequence is a terminal stress test for the film's atmospheric rendering hardware, requiring a massive impulse transfer of data through the rendering pipeline. The atmospheric load of Earth-42 represents a terminal error in the multiversal logic. At 013420, we audit the Miles Morales unit as he arrives in this displaced sector. The Kelvin scale is uncomfortably green and purple, creating a high-magnitude cognitive dissonance for the asset. The volumetric haze is thick with pollution and sensor noise, reflecting the crime-ridden urban infrastructure of a world without a Spider-Man defensive relay. The luminance gradient is low, with most light sources being dim neon relays and flickering fluorescent tubes. This dark matter-saturated atmospheric load is a visual representation of the biological fallout occurring in this dimension. The refractive index of the air feels heavy and oppressive, increasing the friction coefficient of Miles' movements. This diagnostic confirms that Earth-42 is a state of total system failure, where the narrative backbone has been replaced by a predatory prowler protocol. The spatial aliasing in this sector is characterized by high bit depth shadows and a total lack of the bright Shameik logic seen in Miles' home universe. We deconstruct the virtual lens hardware utilized to capture these varying atmospheric loads. The directorial unit employed an anamorphic simulation protocol for the majority of the 90-minute timeline. This protocol emulates the characteristics of a 40mm anamorphic lens, including its specific refractive index and bokeh distortion. At 003545, during the rooftop celebration on Earth 1610, the depth of field is calibrated to create a soft focus on the background Brooklyn lattice. This emphasizes the emotional friction between the biological assets in the foreground. The lens axis is occasionally tilted to create a Dutch angle effect, a visual metric for the growing instability in the multiversal matrix. The bit depth of the light reflections, the specular glint, is boosted using a custom caustic interference algorithm, making the city lights appear as high-density photon clusters. This forensic attention to the optical hardware ensures that each universe's atmospheric load is not just seen, but perceived as a physical substrate with its own unique laws of physics. The physics logic of the volumetric haze is a critical nodal point in our atmospheric audit. This haze is not a static background element. It is a dynamic lattice of particles that reacts to the kinetic potential of the assets. In the Mumbaton Bridge collapse at 010415, the haze is composed of pulverized concrete particles and thermal smoke. The movement of the spider assets through this particulate substrate creates a measurable wake, visualizing the vector sum of their propulsive force. The photon density of the sunlight relays is scattered by these particles, creating God rays that follow a pre-calculated luminance gradient. This interaction between the atmospheric load and the action hardware provides a high-fidelity diagnostic of the impulse magnitude of the structural deflection. The bit depth of the smoke simulations is pushed to its absolute limit, requiring a massive frame buffer to maintain the visual integrity of the scene. This forensic deconstruction proves that the atmospheric load is an active participant in the narrative relay, providing the physical friction coefficient against which the characters must struggle. The cumulative audit of the atmospheric load verifies that the multiversal matrix is a perfectly calibrated system state. Every Kelvin scale iteration, every volumetric haze density, and every luminance gradient shift is a data point in the film's high-fidelity architectural blueprint. The bit depth of the atmospheric logic ensures that the viewer experiences a high-magnitude synaptic response loop, distinguishing the different universes through their unique optical hardware. The forensic deconstruction of the multiversal matrix confirms that the atmospheric load is the primary relay for narrative identity, anchoring the chaotic spatial aliasing of the Spider-Verse in a tangible and recognizable infrastructure. The system state is verified. The atmospheric audit is complete. The final act transition toward Beyond the Spider-Verse is already being calibrated with new optical parameters, promising an even higher velocity of visual innovation. The chromatic saturation levels during the multiversal transit sequences provide a forensic record of the spatial aliasing between universes. At 004315, as the Miles and Gwen units enter the interdimensional pipeline, the atmospheric load reaches a state of peak saturation. The photon density in the pipeline is a swirling caustic interference of all 6 universal matrices. This high-frequency luminance gradient creates a massive cognitive dissonance for the biological assets, whose internal programming is not designed for such rapid environmental shifts. The virtual lens axis is pushed to an extreme focal length, creating a tunnel vision effect that simulates the high angular velocity of the displacement. The bit depth of the pipeline colors is a kaleidoscopic logic that defies standard refractive index rules. This sequence is a primary relay for the film's technical ambition, proving that the atmospheric load can be used as a propulsive force for the narrative relay. The transition from the watercolor logic of Gwen's world to the warm yellow haze of Mumbatin is handled through a localized atmospheric patch that bridges the 2 conflicting matrices. We audit the zero luminance gradient of the spot's final form on Earth 1610. At 012800, the asset stands as a nodal point of dark matter. The atmospheric load in his immediate vicinity is completely erased, replaced by a high-density void substrate. This creates a unique optical distortion where the surrounding city lights are bent and warped around the spot's body, a phenomenon known as gravitational lensing. The sensor noise in this sector is intense, as the spot's portals vibrate at a frequency that disrupts the local photon density relay. The caustic interference of the white ink spatter against his black shell creates a high-frequency visual jitter that triggers an anomaly detection response in the viewer. The depth of field is manipulated to emphasize the spot's status as a multiversal error, making the background Brooklyn lattice appear as a flat and fragile backdrop. This forensic diagnostic proves that the spot is not just a character, but an atmospheric event, a terminal load that threatens to collapse the entire narrative backbone of the universe. During the battle against the Renaissance vulture at 000930, the luminance gradient of the Guggenheim matrix is disrupted by the entity's archaic hardware. The vulture's mechanical wings emit a low-frequency sepia glow that conflicts with the cool museum lighting. This atmospheric friction is a forensic marker of his dimensional displacement. The directorial unit utilized a specific sensor noise protocol to emulate the look of aged celluloid during his close-up iterations. The volumetric haze in the museum is thick with dust particles kicked up by the struggle, creating a tangible friction coefficient for the kinetic vectors. Each photon hit on the vulture's parchment wings is calculated with a unique refractive index, ensuring that the ancient substrate looks physically present in the modern matrix. This attention to the luminance gradient calibration ensures that the high-fidelity action remains grounded in a believable atmospheric infrastructure. The resulting visual configuration is a high-magnitude diagnostic of the multiversal logic at work. The interaction between the atmospheric load and the asset's neural mapping is most evident on Earth 65. At 000500, as Gwen Stacy reacts to the termination of the Peter Parker variant, the entire world's Kelvin scale shifts into a deep blue and violet saturation. This represents a behavioral drift where the atmospheric load is no longer an external substrate, but an extension of the asset's biological status. The luminance gradient bleeds from the top of the frame, a visual metric of Gwen's overwhelming emotional load. The volumetric haze in this scene is low, focusing the bit depth on the asset's facial expressions and the forensic details of the gym wreckage. This iteration proves that the atmospheric logic of Earth 65 is a reactive system state, a high-fidelity projection of the asset's internal programming. The refractive index of the tears in Gwen's eyes is boosted to create a specular glint that catches the flickering light of the ambulance relays. This forensic deconstruction confirms that the atmosphere is the primary relay for the film's emotional logic. The total system state of the atmospheric load across the 90-minute timeline is a masterpiece of technical calibration. Every Kelvin scale iteration, every volumetric haze density, and every luminance gradient shift is a data point in the film's architectural blueprint. The bit depth of the atmospheric logic ensures that the viewer experiences a high-magnitude synaptic response loop, distinguishing the different universes through their unique optical hardware. Forensic deconstruction of the multiversal matrix confirms that the atmospheric load is the primary engine of dimensional identity. The system state is verified. The diagnostic is complete. Every photon density relay and spatial aliasing logic has been tracked and audited. The result is a high-fidelity cinematic cassette that pushes the boundaries of modern animation and human processing. The diagnostic report for Chapter 19 is now closed. The Miguel O'Hara asset, identified as the primary control node of the Earth 928 matrix, functions as the central processing unit for the Spider Society's global protocol. We initiate a forensic audit of the O'Hara unit's biological configuration at 010815, as he presides over the New York command matrix. The asset exhibits a high-magnitude behavioral drift from the standard Spider-Man baseline. His biological backbone is a result of a self-induced DNA iteration, splicing human genetic data with a vampire spider matrix. This results in a physical configuration featuring retractable red energized talons and a pair of hollow fangs designed for the impulse transfer of paralytic toxins. The neural mapping of the O'Hara unit shows a chronic stress metric, likely a byproduct of the past data corruption event, where his attempt to replace a deceased variant resulted in the total structural deflection of an entire reality lattice. This past terminal error serves as the primary stimulus for his current rigid adherence to the canon event system state. Moving to the clinical diagnostic of the command deck substrate, the O'Hara asset utilizes a high bit depth holographic relay identified as Lila. This AI relay functions as the primary relay for multiversal anomaly detection, processing millions of data points per second to monitor for narrative drift. The photon density of the holographic matrix is calibrated to match the cool Kelvin scale of the New York architecture. O'Hara stands at the nodal point of this assembly. His suit, a high-density fabric utilizing unstable molecule logic, exhibiting a constant spatial aliasing effect. The suit's red luminance gradient flickers according to the asset's heart rate and internal stress metric. When the Miles Morales asset enters the tactical geometry of the command matrix, the O'Hara unit initiates a behavioral diagnostic. He views the Morales unit not as a biological asset, but as a terminal error, or original anomaly, that has introduced a massive caustic interference into the multiversal blueprint. We audit the stimulus-response loop during the Canon event lecture at 011520. The O'Hara unit activates a series of holographic relays that project the narrative infrastructure of the Spider-Verse as a massive interconnected web lattice. Each strand in this lattice represents a nodal point where a specific event must occur to maintain the system state's integrity. The O'Hara asset explains the logic of the police captain termination protocol with a cold, diagnostic tone. His internal programming is locked into a deterministic loop. He believes that any structural deflection from this blueprint will result in the total dissolution of the host universe. The cognitive dissonance between O'Hara's desire for order and the Morales unit's desire for autonomy creates a high-friction environment. The O'Hara unit's kinetic potential is held in a state of preload tension, his talons extending and retracting as the Morales asset questions the validity of the canon system state. The behavioral drift reaches a state of peak friction at 011815, when Miles Morales initiates a deviation log by attempting to leave the command matrix. The O'Hara asset immediately shifts into an active suppression protocol. His kinetic potential is unleashed in a high-magnitude impulse transfer, launching his physical mass across the room with a massive angular velocity. He utilizes a specialized red-energized web relay, which functions on a high photon density logic to trap the Morales unit. The torque load generated by O'Hara's movement is sufficient to shatter the nearby holographic consoles, creating a shower of digital fragments and sensor noise. The O'Hara unit's vocal frequencies shift into a low-decibel growl, reflecting a state of high-magnitude psychological stress. He perceives the Morales unit's exit maneuver as a direct threat to the stability of the multiversal lattice, triggering a total system shutdown logic in his defensive relays. Shifting the forensic focus to the external vertical pipeline of New York at 012100, we analyze the O'Hara unit's pursuit tactics. He moves with a zero-friction kinetic logic, his red cape unit functioning as a hard-light aerodynamic stabilizer. This cape allows for high-velocity maneuvering within the city's high-density atmospheric load. The O'Hara unit's angular velocity during the swing cycle is tracked at over 100 kilometers per hour. He utilizes his energized talons to create anchor points on the brutalist concrete substrate of the buildings, leaving behind deep gouges in the architectural backbone. The vector sum of his movements is a clinical execution of pursuit geometry. He coordinates the hundreds of secondary spider assets through a high-frequency neural link, directing the entire society matrix as a single, massive containment hardware. This demonstrates his role as the master relay of the entire defensive infrastructure. A diagnostic of the O'Hara unit's combat logic during the train substrate encounter reveals a high-magnitude shear force output. As he pins the Morales unit against the high-speed transit hardware, he exerts a pressure metric of several thousand newtons per square centimeter. His fangs are bared, indicating a transition from a containment protocol to a lethal suppression protocol. The cognitive dissonance of the O'Hara unit is absolute. He is willing to sacrifice a single biological asset to preserve the multiversal backbone. He reveals the terminal error of Miles' origin, declaring that the spider from Earth-42 was never intended to bite a unit on Earth-1610. This data corruption is, in Miguel's logic, the reason the original Peter Parker variant was terminated. The O'Hara unit's luminance gradient is now saturated with deep red and black tones, reflecting a total system error in his emotional calibration. He is no longer functioning as a hero, but as a high-velocity personification of the canon itself. We audit the behavioral drift of the O'Hara asset as the Morales unit initiates his final escape maneuver using the go-home machine. The O'Hara unit's response to the failure of the containment matrix is a state of near-terminal rage. He slams his physical mass against the containment field, his red-energized talons creating a massive caustic interference against the digital substrate. The sensor noise generated by his vocalization reaches peak decibels, a raw output of psychological trauma and system failure. He turns his attention to the Gwen Stacy unit, identifying her as a secondary cause of the data corruption. He initiates a terminal ejection protocol, forcibly removing Gwen from the Spider Society matrix and returning her to Earth-65. This act represents the total dissolution of the Tactical Alliance, as O'Hara sacrifices his primary assets to maintain a crumbling system state. The final diagnostic of the Miguel O'Hara unit at 013000 shows an asset whose internal programming has reached a state of terminal exhaustion. He stands amidst the structural deflection of the New York command matrix, his physical configuration showing signs of high-magnitude fatigue. He has failed to arrest the Morales anomaly, and the cannon is now in a state of high-velocity instability. He coordinates a final search grid with Jess Drew and Ben Riley, preparing for a high-magnitude displacement to Earth-1610 to prevent the next narrative drift. The O'Hara unit's neural mapping shows a complete resolution of his cognitive dissonance into a single, monochromatic objective, the forensic erasure of the anomaly. He is the guardian of a dying lattice, a high-fidelity machine unit that will destroy anything to prevent a total system reset. The interaction between Miguel O'Hara and the Peter B. Parker asset provides a critical metric for the Spider Society's internal friction. Peter B. Parker represents a behavioral drift toward organic logic and parental responsibility, which conflicts with O'Hara's brutalist blueprint. During the New York chase, O'Hara dismisses Peter's concerns with a clinical indifference, viewing the Mayday unit as a secondary variable that interferes with the primary relay. This conflict logic is a forensic indicator of the growing instability in the society's social architecture. O'Hara's inability to integrate the organic needs of his biological assets into his deterministic logic is his primary failure metric. His reliance on the canon as a rigid backbone has blinded him to the kinetic potential of the individual anomaly. This behavioral audit confirms that Miguel O'Hara is as much a victim of the multiversal matrix as he is its master. We deconstruct the optical hardware used to render the Miguel O'Hara unit. The directorial unit utilized a specific spatial aliasing protocol to emphasize his out-of-time status. His animation refresh rate is often calibrated to 24 frames per second, even when the surrounding assets are operating on a 12-frame baseline. This creates a measurable parallax shift that makes him appear more solid and physically present than the other Spider units. The refractive index of his hard light cape is calculated with a high photon density to simulate a semi-transparent energy substrate. This high-fidelity visual delivery is a primary relay for his status as the most powerful and technically advanced asset in the multiverse. The caustic interference generated by his energized talons is a visual marker of his high kinetic potential, a warning signal to any unit that attempts to disrupt his protocol. Final state analysis of the Miguel O'Hara behavioral audit verifies a terminal commitment to the canon infrastructure. Every impulse transfer, every tactical geometry, and every behavioral drift he executes is a data point in the film's forensic deconstruction of authority. He is the ultimate stabilizer, a machine-turned man whose neural mapping is a blueprint for the maintenance of a static multiverse. The bit depth of his conflict with Miles Morales is the primary engine of the film's narrative velocity. The forensic report is now closed, with all data points confirming the high-octane control logic of the Earth-928 primary asset. The system state is critical. The O'Hara unit is engaged in a final act displacement toward the impending collision nodal point. Every red talon mark left on the Nueva York vertical pipeline is a forensic record of O'Hara's desperate attempt to hold reality together. The sheer force he exerts on the Miles Morales unit is a measurable metric of the cannon's crushing weight. The O'Hara asset is the firewall of the multiverse, a high-frequency defensive relay that has become a source of data corruption itself. His adherence to the blueprint has resulted in a structural deflection of his own humanity. As he prepares for the final act iteration, his internal programming is a monochromatic logic. Save the matrix, erase the anomaly. The bit depth of this conviction is the terminal threshold of the Spider-Verse's conflict. The diagnostic is complete. The O'Hara unit is verified as a high-fidelity personification of deterministic friction.